Good evening, and welcome back to another journey through time. Tonight, we turn our gaze toward ancient Rome, toward marble columns and military camps, toward a man who sat upon the throne of the world, yet sought wisdom in the quiet hours before dawn. Get comfortable, settle in, and let your mind drift back nearly 2,000 years to an empire at its zenith and a soul wrestling with the weight of infinite responsibility. In the stillness of a military tent somewhere along the Danube River, as winter winds howl across the frozen plains and soldiers huddle around dying campfires, a man sits alone by candlelight. He is 50-something years old, his body weakened by years of campaigning and chronic illness, his face lined with the cares of empire. Around him, the Roman world stretches from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, the greatest dominion humanity has ever known. He is Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome, commander of legions, master of millions. And yet, in this quiet moment, he writes not grand proclamations or military orders, but simple reminders to himself, notes about patience, observations on mortality, questions about how to live well when the world offers only chaos and pain. These private reflections, never meant for publication, never intended for any eyes but his own, would one day become known as the Meditations. They would survive the collapse of the empire that produced them, outlast the marble palaces and bronze statues, and speak across the centuries to anyone who has ever struggled with duty, loss, or the search for meaning. But before we explore those words, we must understand the man who wrote them. We must trace his journey from a boy born into privilege to a reluctant philosopher forced to become a warrior, from a student of wisdom to the most powerful person in the known world, from a man who wanted nothing more than to study and contemplate, to one who spent his final years fighting endless wars on frozen frontiers far from home. This is not a tale of conquest or glory, though there will be battles. It is not a story of triumph, though there were victories. This is the story of a human being, remarkable yet profoundly ordinary, who faced impossible circumstances with quiet dignity. It is the story of a man who believed that the quality of our lives depends not on what happens to us, but on how we choose to respond. And it is the story of how ancient wisdom, forged in hardship and written by firelight, continues to offer guidance in a world that feels, in so many ways, just as uncertain as the one Marcus knew. The paradox of Marcus Aurelius is this: he is remembered not for the wars he won or the territories he held, but for what he thought in the darkness, alone, when no one was watching. He is celebrated not because he wielded power, but because he questioned it constantly, holding himself to impossible standards while knowing he would inevitably fall short. He has become, across the ages, a model of thoughtful leadership precisely because he never wanted to lead, and a symbol of philosophical wisdom because he spent most of his life unable to practice philosophy in the way he desired. So tonight, let us walk with Marcus through the corridors of his life. Let us see him as a boy in Rome, fascinated by ideas that promised something deeper than wealth or status. Let us watch him learn, reluctantly, the arts of governance and war. Let us stand beside him as the world crumbles, as plague ravages his empire, and barbarians breach its borders, as he loses family members and friends, as everything he was trained to believe about order and civilization seems to dissolve. And let us finally look over his shoulder as he writes in that military tent, trying to make sense of it all, trying to find a way to remain human in inhuman circumstances.
His story begins not with philosophy or war, but with a birth in the city of Rome in the year 121 of the Common Era, when the empire stood at the height of its power, and no one could have imagined that the child born that spring day would one day embody both its greatest virtues and witness the beginning of its long decline. On the 26th day of April, in the year 121, a son was born to a patrician family in Rome. The child entered the world not into poverty or obscurity, but into the very heart of Roman power, into a family whose connections reached the highest levels of the imperial court. His name at birth was Marcus Annius Verus, and from his first breath, destiny seemed to mark him for something beyond ordinary life. His paternal grandfather, also named Marcus Annius Verus, had already served as consul twice, one of the highest honors in Rome, and held the prestigious position of prefect of Rome, effectively the mayor of the Eternal City. This was no minor appointment. The prefect commanded the urban cohorts, maintained public order, and wielded authority second only to the emperor himself within the city's ancient walls. To be born into such a family meant connections, influence, and expectations that would shape every moment of young Marcus's life. His maternal grandmother, Rupilia Faustina, was heiress to one of Rome's most massive fortunes, accumulated through generations of careful management and imperial favor. Wealth in Rome was not simply about gold and estates, though the family possessed both in abundance. It was about influence, about the ability to sponsor games and festivals, to support artists and philosophers, to maintain a household that reflected the dignity of Roman civilization. Marcus grew up surrounded by comfort, yes, but also by a particular kind of responsibility that came with such privilege. His father, Marcus Annius Verus II, was a man of impeccable reputation, noted for his integrity and his adherence to traditional Roman values. He served as praetor, a judicial magistrate, demonstrating the family's continued commitment to public service. But Marcus would have few memories of his father, for the elder Annius Verus died when his son was only 3 years old. This early loss might have been devastating for a child in less fortunate circumstances, but the Roman aristocracy had developed elaborate systems to ensure that orphan children of noble families were properly cared for and educated. The young boy was raised primarily by his mother, Domitia Lucilla, a woman of considerable intelligence and culture, and by his maternal great-grandfather, who took a particular interest in the child's development. But it was his paternal grandfather who would exert the most profound influence on his early years. The elder Marcus Annius Verus, already elderly when his grandson was born, was a man of the old school, steeped in traditional Roman virtues of duty, discipline, and dignity. He represented a link to an earlier age, before the excesses that had marked some emperors' reigns, when service to the state was considered the highest calling, and personal character mattered more than mere power. In his meditations, written decades later, Marcus would remember his grandfather with deep affection, thanking him for teaching him about good character and the control of temper. This might seem like a small thing, but for the Romans, temperance, the ability to govern one's passions and maintain equanimity regardless of circumstance, was essential to civilization itself. A man who could not control himself could never hope to govern others. The lessons learned at his grandfather's knee, watching how a man of dignity carried himself through the world, would stay with Marcus throughout his life. The household in which Marcus grew up was one of learning and culture. Rome in the early 2nd century was at the height of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, that remarkable period of relative stability and prosperity that had begun under Augustus and would continue, with some interruptions, until Marcus's own death. The empire was vast, stretching from the misty hills of Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia, from the Rhine and Danube rivers in the north to the cataracts of the Nile in the south. Trade flourished, cities grew, and Greek and Roman culture blended into a cosmopolitan civilization unlike anything the world had seen. In such an environment, education was prized. Wealthy Roman families hired the finest tutors, importing Greek scholars to teach their children rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, and the arts. Young Marcus showed an aptitude for learning from an early age, demonstrating not just intelligence, but a kind of seriousness, a gravity unusual in one so young. He learned Latin and Greek, as all educated Romans did, but he seemed to prefer Greek, the language of philosophy and high culture. Later, he would write his most famous work in Greek rather than his native Latin, a choice that speaks volumes about his intellectual orientation and his sense of where true wisdom resided. But Marcus's childhood was not solely about books and lessons. He lived in Rome itself, the caput mundi, the head of the world, a city of marble temples and crowded streets, of forums where politics and commerce mingled, of aqueducts that brought fresh water from distant mountains, of public baths where citizens gathered to socialize and discuss the issues of the day. It was a world of contrasts, of high culture and brutal violence, of legal refinement and arbitrary power. Into this world, young Marcus was being groomed to take his place among the elite, to continue his family's tradition of service and distinction. But no one, not even the astrologers and seers who claimed to read the future in the stars, could have predicted the extraordinary path that lay ahead. When Marcus was around 6 years old, something happened that would change the trajectory of his life entirely. The Emperor Hadrian, that restless, brilliant, complicated man who had traveled throughout the empire, building walls in Britain and cities in the East, who wrote poetry and designed buildings, who loved Greek culture and handsome young men, took notice of the boy. Perhaps it was Marcus's precocious seriousness that caught the emperor's eye. Perhaps it was the family's impeccable connections. Or perhaps Hadrian, who had no children of his own and was already thinking about succession, saw something in the child that reminded him of himself, or that suggested a kind of character rarely found even among the nobility. Whatever the reason, Hadrian bestowed upon the boy a remarkable honor. He nicknamed him Verissimus, the most truthful one, a play on the boy's family name Verus, which meant true. It was not a casual compliment. For Hadrian to single out a child in this way was to mark him as special, to suggest that he might have a role to play in the empire's future. The nickname stuck, and young Marcus found himself drawn deeper into the emperor's orbit, invited to the imperial court, noticed and remembered by the most powerful man in the world. But with this honor came a weight that the boy could not yet fully understand. To be singled out by an emperor was both blessing and burden. It meant opportunity, but also obligation. It meant that his life would not entirely be his own, that the choices available to ordinary Romans, even ordinary aristocrats, might not be available to him. And as Marcus grew older, as he moved from childhood into adolescence, as his mind awakened to questions about meaning and purpose and how one should live, this tension between duty and desire, between obligation and authenticity, would become one of the central struggles of his existence. For now, though, he was simply a boy, serious beyond his years, growing up in the heart of the greatest city on earth, loved by his family, noticed by his emperor, and about to encounter ideas that would shape not only his own life, but echo across 2,000 years of human thought. The seeds of the philosopher emperor were being planted in those early Roman years, though neither Marcus nor anyone around him could have known what strange and difficult fruit those seeds would bear.
The Awakening. When Marcus Annius Verus was 11 years old, something shifted within him. It was not a dramatic moment, no thunderbolt of revelation or mystical experience, but rather a quiet turning of his attention toward questions that most children never think to ask. How should one live? What matters truly? What can we control? And what must we accept? These are the kinds of questions that philosophers had been asking for centuries, but for young Marcus they became personal, urgent, alive. The catalyst for this awakening was a man named Diognetus, a painting master who had been hired to teach the boy the visual arts. But Diognetus was more than an art teacher. He was also a philosopher, or at least someone who lived according to philosophical principles, and he introduced Marcus to what the Greeks called the philosophic way of life. This was not philosophy as we often think of it today, not merely an academic subject or theoretical speculation. For the ancient Greeks and Romans who took it seriously, philosophy was a complete approach to living, a discipline that governed how you dressed, what you ate, how you spent your time, what you valued, and how you responded to everything that happened to you. Diognetus practiced Stoicism, one of the major philosophical schools of the Hellenistic and Roman period, and he taught not primarily through lectures or books, but through example. Young Marcus watched how this man carried himself through the world, how he maintained composure regardless of circumstances, how he seemed unaffected by the praise and criticism that swayed others, and the boy was captivated. In April of the year 132, Marcus did something that shocked his family and made him the talk of the household. At Diognetus's behest, he took up the dress and habits of a philosopher. He abandoned the fine togas and comfortable tunics that befitted a boy of his station, and instead wore a rough Greek cloak, the kind that Stoic and Cynic philosophers wore to signal their rejection of luxury and their commitment to living simply. More dramatically, he insisted on sleeping on the floor rather than in his comfortable bed, a practice meant to toughen the body and remind the practitioner that comfort is not necessary for happiness. His mother, Domitia Lucilla, was alarmed. Here was her son, heir to one of Rome's great families, destined for high office and important responsibilities, deliberately embracing discomfort and adopting the appearance of a wandering philosopher. She must have worried about what people would think, about whether this was healthy for the boy, about whether he was taking things too far. Eventually, she persuaded him to at least sleep on a bed, though Marcus's commitment to philosophical practice remained strong. It was a compromise that foreshadowed his entire life, maintaining the outward forms that society required, while trying to live according to inner principles that often conflicted with those forms. But what was Stoicism, this philosophy that so captivated young Marcus? To understand the man he would become, we must understand the ideas that shaped him from this impressionable age. Stoicism was founded around 300 years before Marcus's birth by a Phoenician merchant named Zeno of Citium. Zeno had been shipwrecked and lost his fortune, and in his reduced circumstances, he wandered into a bookshop in Athens, where he encountered the philosophic works of Socrates. He was so moved by what he read that he devoted the rest of his life to philosophy, eventually founding his own school. Zeno taught in a public colonnade in Athens called the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, from which the philosophy took its name. His teaching emphasized that virtue, meaning moral and intellectual excellence, was the only true good, and vice the only true evil. Everything else, all the things that people ordinarily chase or fear, wealth and poverty, health and sickness, pleasure and pain, honor and disgrace,
Even life and death themselves were classified as indifference. This did not mean they did not matter at all, but that they had no moral value in themselves. They were not what made a life good or bad. What mattered was how you responded to these indifferents, whether you met them with wisdom, justice, courage, and self-control, the four cardinal virtues. A person could be poor, sick, dishonored, and facing death, and yet, if they maintained their virtue, if they responded to these circumstances with reason and integrity, their life was good. Conversely, someone could possess every external advantage, every form of wealth and power and pleasure, but if they lacked virtue, if they were unjust, cowardly, foolish, and intemperate, their life was bad, regardless of their circumstances. This might seem like a strange and even harsh way of thinking about the world, but for Marcus and countless others who embraced Stoicism, it was profoundly liberating. It meant that happiness was not dependent on luck or external circumstances. It meant that even in the worst situations, you retained control over the thing that mattered most, your own character, your own choices, your own responses. As Epictetus put it, the Stoic philosopher whose works Marcus would later study intensely, some things are up to us, and some things are not up to us. What is up to us are our judgments, our desires, our actions, our choices. What is not up to us includes our body, our property, our reputation, our position in life, and everything external to our moral choices. The Stoics believed that the universe was governed by logos, a divine reason or intelligence that ordered all things for the best. Everything that happened was part of this rational order, and a wise person learned to accept what happened, not with resignation, but with understanding that it was part of a larger pattern, even if that pattern was not immediately visible to limited human understanding. This did not mean becoming passive or failing to try to improve things. It meant distinguishing between what was in your control and what was not, acting virtuously with regard to what was in your control, and accepting with equanimity what was not. For young Marcus, these ideas resonated deeply, perhaps because he had already experienced loss, his father's death when he was small, perhaps because, as a thoughtful child in a privileged position, he had already sensed the fragility and uncertainty that underlies all human life, no matter how secure it appears. Or perhaps it was simply his nature, his temperament, drawn to ideas that emphasized duty, self-discipline, and inner strength over pleasure, display, and external validation. A new set of tutors took over Marcus's education around the age of 11 or 12. There was Alexander of Kottayam, a Homeric scholar who taught him Greek literature and emphasized careful writing and precision with words over rhetorical flourishes. There were Latin teachers as well, Trossius Aper and Tutitius Procillus, ensuring that Marcus mastered his native language with the same care he brought to Greek. But perhaps most significantly, there was Marcus Cornelius Fronto, one of the most famous orators and rhetoricians of the age. Fronto was a man who lived for words, who believed in the power of eloquent speech and beautiful writing to move minds and change the world. And Fronto and Marcus formed a close bond, and their letters to each other, which survive in fragmentary form, reveal a genuine affection between teacher and student. Fronto tried to shape Marcus into a great orator, someone who could sway the Senate and command audiences with the power of his rhetoric. But as Marcus grew older, while he appreciated Fronto's teaching and remained personally fond of him, he began to feel that rhetoric, for all its beauty, was somewhat empty compared to philosophy. The ability to speak beautifully mattered less than living rightly. This tension between rhetoric and philosophy, between style and substance, was a common theme in Roman education. The Romans inherited from the Greeks both the sophistical tradition, which emphasized the art of persuasion and beautiful speaking, and the philosophical tradition, which emphasized truth and virtue. Marcus would ultimately choose philosophy, but he did so with a kind of gentleness to those like Fronto who chose differently. In his meditations, he would thank Fronto for teaching him about envy and duplicity and hypocrisy among tyrants, showing that even from teachers whose primary emphasis was not philosophy, he had learned valuable moral lessons. As Marcus moved through his teenage years, his commitment to philosophy deepened. He studied the works of the early Stoics, reading Chrysippus and Zeno through second-hand accounts and collections of their sayings. He read Plato, whose Socratic dialogues portrayed philosophy as a living practice, a way of examining oneself and testing one's beliefs through rigorous questioning. And he seems to have been particularly influenced by the works of Epictetus, a Stoic teacher who had lived just a generation before Marcus, and whose teaching had been recorded by his student Arrian in works called the Discourses and the Enchiridion, or Handbook.
Epictetus had been born a slave and remained one for much of his early life, owned by Epaphroditus, a powerful freedman who served the Emperor Nero. Despite his lowly status, or perhaps because of it, Epictetus developed a philosophy of radical inner freedom. He taught that no one could enslave your mind, that your thoughts and judgments belonged to you alone, that even in chains, a person who had cultivated virtue and reason was freer than any tyrant. After being freed from slavery, Epictetus became a teacher, and his school in Nicopolis attracted students from across the empire. For Marcus, reading Epictetus must have been revelatory. Here was someone from the lowest stratum of society teaching the same fundamental truths that Marcus was learning, but with a directness and practical focus that perhaps resonated even more than the more abstract writings of earlier Stoics. Epictetus taught through example and analogy, showing how Stoic principles applied to everyday situations. He emphasized the three disciplines that a Stoic should practice: the discipline of desire, learning to desire only what is good and avoid only what is evil; the discipline of action, acting justly and appropriately toward all people; and the discipline of assent, examining your impressions and judgments to ensure they are accurate and rational. Marcus absorbed these teachings, making them part of his daily practice. Philosophy for him was never merely theoretical. It was a set of exercises, spiritual and mental disciplines that had to be practiced constantly. Each morning he would remind himself of Stoic principles. Each evening he would review his day, examining where he had succeeded in living virtuously and where he had fallen short. This practice of self-examination, of constant vigilance over one's thoughts and reactions, would continue throughout his life and would eventually produce the meditations themselves, a record of these ongoing internal conversations. But even as philosophy became central to Marcus's identity, events in the wider world were about to pull him in a direction he had not chosen and did not particularly want. The Emperor Hadrian was growing old, and he was childless. The question of succession, always fraught in the Roman Empire, was becoming urgent, and Marcus, the boy who wanted nothing more than to study philosophy and live a quiet, examined life, was about to be drawn into the machinery of imperial power from which there would be no escape. The philosophical awakening of his youth would soon be tested in ways he could not imagine, and the ideas he had embraced would have to sustain him through decades of responsibilities and hardships that would have broken a less prepared soul. The path to power. In late 136, Emperor Hadrian nearly died from a hemorrhage. He was in his early 60s, his health failing after years of restless travels across the empire. Convalescing at his magnificent villa in Tivoli, surrounded by architectural marvels of his own design,
Hadrian faced the question that had haunted emperors since Augustus: who would succeed him? The empire could not be left without a clear line of succession. The last thing Rome needed was a return to civil war, rival claimants tearing the state apart in their competition for power. Hadrian had no biological children, no obvious heir, so he did what several emperors before him had done. He looked for the most capable man available and adopted him as his son and successor. His choice fell upon Lucius Ceionius Commodus, who was given the name Lucius Aelius Caesar upon his adoption. The reasons for this choice are murky. Aelius was handsome, charming, and well-connected, but he was not known for any particular competence or philosophical gravity. More significantly, he was also in poor health, suffering from some chronic condition that would soon prove fatal. But there was a connection between Aelius and young Marcus that made this adoption personally significant. Aelius had a daughter, and that daughter was betrothed to Marcus. The 15-year-old boy was thus destined to become the emperor's grandson through marriage, a position that would inevitably bring him closer to power. Then, in January of 138, less than 2 years after his adoption, Lucius Aelius Caesar died, likely from the illness that had plagued him. Hadrian, now even more urgently needing a successor, was left without an heir. What happened next would determine not just the next emperor, but the next two, and would set the stage for one of the most remarkable periods in Roman history. On the 24th of January, 138, Hadrian made his choice. He selected Titus Aurelius Antoninus, the husband of Marcus's aunt, Faustina the Elder, to be his successor. Antoninus was 51 years old, a senator of impeccable reputation, wealthy, respected, and known for his moderate and sensible approach to governance. But Hadrian imposed conditions on the adoption that revealed his longer-term thinking. Antoninus, in turn, was required to adopt 2 young men as his own sons and heirs. The first was Lucius, the son of the recently deceased Aelius Caesar, ensuring that Hadrian's original choice would not be entirely forgotten. The second was Marcus, now 17 years old, who would become Marcus Aelius Aurelius Verus. The message was clear. Hadrian was looking not just to the immediate succession, but 2 generations ahead. Antoninus, it seemed, was meant to be a kind of regent, a stable and competent placeholder who would rule while the younger men matured. And of those 2, Marcus was clearly the one Hadrian believed most worthy, the one whose character and abilities suggested the possibility of greatness. For Marcus, this adoption was profoundly disturbing. He had not sought power. He had not dreamed of wearing the purple, commanding legions, or ruling the world. His dreams were of philosophy, of the quiet life of study and contemplation, perhaps teaching others as Epictetus had taught, living simply and thinking deeply about the great questions of existence. To be thrust into this position was for him a kind of violation of everything he valued. When he discovered that Hadrian had adopted him, Marcus reportedly responded not with joy, but with apprehension and sadness. In the Meditations, written decades later, he would pointedly not thank Hadrian for anything, a striking omission, given that he thanks almost everyone else who influenced his life. This was not simple ingratitude. It was a quiet protest, a way of saying that this path had been imposed upon him, not chosen. He moved reluctantly from his mother's house to Hadrian's private residence, leaving behind a life he loved for one he dreaded. Yet his Stoic training provided a framework for accepting what could not be changed. The Stoics taught that we must distinguish between what is in our control and what is not. Marcus had not chosen to be adopted, had not chosen to be marked for imperial succession, but he could choose how he responded to these facts. His duty, as he understood it, was clear. If fate or providence or the ordering of the universe had placed him in this position, then he had an obligation to fulfill it virtuously. To refuse would be to shirk his responsibility to the larger community, to place his personal preferences above the needs of millions. This tension between personal desire and public duty would define Marcus's entire life. He was a man who wanted to be a philosopher, but was forced to be an emperor. And yet, his philosophical training gave him a way to reconcile these apparently contradictory roles. The Stoics taught that a truly wise person accepts their role in the cosmic order, whatever that role may be. Some are meant to teach, others to farm, still others to govern. The important thing is not what role you have been assigned, but whether you fulfill it with virtue and excellence. Hadrian died in July of 138. The Senate, grateful to be rid of an emperor who had become increasingly erratic and cruel in his final years, hesitated to grant him divine honors, but Antoninus, displaying the character that would earn him the title Pius, insisted that the man who had chosen him be properly honored. It was an act of pietas, of dutiful respect, that set the tone for his reign and demonstrated the values that Marcus would observe closely during the next 23 years. The reign of Antoninus Pius from 138 to 161 was remarkable for its stability and peace. Unlike Hadrian, who had traveled constantly and involved himself in every detail of provincial administration, Antoninus never left Italy during his entire reign. He governed from Rome, delegating authority to capable subordinates, maintaining the empire's defenses without engaging in major wars of conquest, and presiding over what would later be remembered as a kind of golden age of peace and prosperity. For Marcus, these were years of training and preparation. He was marked as the heir apparent, and Antoninus took seriously his responsibility to prepare the young man for rule. Marcus was made consul at age 18, an honor that usually came much later in a Roman career. He was given increasingly important administrative responsibilities, learning how the machinery of government worked, how grain supplies worked, how taxes were collected, how the law was administered, how the military was organized and deployed. He also continued his education. Teachers continued to be provided for him, and he maintained his philosophical studies alongside his political training. He read widely, not just in philosophy, but in history, literature, and law. He learned to preside over the Senate, to adjudicate legal disputes, to manage the complex web of relationships that bound the empire together. During these years, Marcus also married. His betrothal to Aelius's daughter had been broken upon his adoption by Antoninus. Instead, he was married to Antoninus's daughter, Faustina, Marcus's cousin. The marriage took place in 145, when Marcus was 24 years old. Faustina was about 16, young by our standards, but typical for aristocratic Roman women of the time. This was a dynastic marriage designed to strengthen the imperial succession, but the historical record suggests it was also, at least from Marcus's perspective, a genuine affection. Marcus would bear Faustina at least 13 children, possibly 14, over the course of their marriage. Of these, only 6 survived past childhood, and several died as infants or young children. The death of children was tragically common in the ancient world, even among the wealthy, but that did not make it easier to bear. Marcus, as we know from his later writings, felt these losses deeply, yet he tried to accept them with Stoic equanimity, as events that were not in his control and therefore should not disturb his inner peace. The relationship between Marcus and Faustina has been the subject of gossip and speculation, both in their own time and later. Rumors circulated that Faustina was unfaithful, that she conducted affairs with gladiators and actors, that she was manipulative and politically ambitious. How much truth there was to these rumors is impossible to determine. Ancient gossip about powerful women was notoriously unreliable, often reflecting misogyny more than reality. What we know for certain is that Marcus honored Faustina during her life and after her death, defending her reputation, having her deified when she died, and establishing charitable institutions in her name.
He mentions her in passing, referring to her character and his fortune in having her as a wife. He does not elaborate much, but the fact that he mentions her at all in a work so private and focused on philosophical principles rather than personal relationships suggests genuine affection and respect. For a Stoic, the ideal was to love appropriately but not excessively, to value relationships as preferred indifference, important and worth cultivating, but not the source of one's happiness or virtue. The 23 years under Antoninus's tutelage were, in many ways, the calmest of Marcus's life. Yes, he was being prepared for supreme power. Yes, he had administrative responsibilities, but the ultimate burden had not yet fallen on his shoulders. Antoninus shielded him from the worst pressures of rule, gave him time to study and develop, allowed him to be, to some extent, still a philosopher, even while training to be an emperor. Marcus watched Antoninus closely, learning not just the mechanics of governance, but the character necessary to govern well. Antoninus was patient, moderate, unpretentious. He lived simply, despite his immense wealth and power. He listened to advisors, but made his own decisions. He was slow to anger and quick to forgive. He maintained the traditions of Rome while avoiding unnecessary cruelty or excess. In his meditations, Marcus would devote an entire section to thanking Antoninus and listing the qualities he learned from his adoptive father. From Antoninus, Marcus learned to be approachable, to examine proposed legislation thoroughly, to persist in working toward clear objectives, to honor genuine philosophers while not being taken in by pretenders, to be courteous without being obsequious, to care for the empire's resources without miserliness, to show consideration for others' opinions while still maintaining his own judgment. These were not abstract virtues, but practical qualities demonstrated daily in how Antoninus conducted himself. Perhaps most importantly, Marcus learned from Antoninus a kind of serenity, a way of bearing the weight of office without being crushed by it. Antoninus seemed to accept his role with grace, neither glorying in his power nor resenting it. He simply did what needed to be done day after day with a steadiness that inspired confidence. For someone like Marcus, who struggled with the gap between what he wanted to do, study philosophy, and what he was required to do, govern an empire, Antoninus's example was invaluable. The years passed. Marcus grew from young man to middle age. He had children, lost children, performed his duties, continued his studies. The empire remained at peace, prosperous, and well-ordered under Antoninus's benign guidance. It was the calm before a storm that no one could have predicted, a period of stability that would soon be revealed as fragile and temporary. But for now, in the late 150s of the Common Era, Rome seemed invincible, eternal, and Marcus could perhaps still hope that when his time came to rule, it would be much like this, peaceful, manageable, allowing time for the philosophical life he still longed for. On March 7th, 161, Antoninus Pius died after 23 years of rule. He was 74 years old, an impressive age for any man in that era. His death was peaceful, and his last word, reportedly, was equanimity, a perfectly Stoic sentiment. The Senate immediately voted to deify him, and unlike Hadrian, there was no opposition. Antoninus had been a genuinely beloved emperor, and his passing was mourned throughout the empire. Marcus, now 39 years old, became emperor. But almost immediately,
he did something unprecedented in Roman history. He insisted that the Senate also make Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, a co-emperor with equal powers. The title they both bore was Augustus, the supreme imperial title, not the subordinate title of Caesar that designated an heir. This was not a senior and junior partnership, but a genuine sharing of power. Why did Marcus do this? The cynic might suggest political calculation, a way to bind a potential rival to himself and prevent civil war. But the historical record suggests Marcus's motivations were more straightforward. He believed in sharing the burden, and he genuinely respected Lucius, or at least felt an obligation to honor Hadrian's original intentions by including Aelius's son in the succession. The Stoics taught that we are social beings, that cooperation is more natural than competition, that the truly wise person works with others for the common good rather than grasping for sole power. The Senate was reportedly shocked by the proposal. Never before had Rome been ruled by two equal emperors. There had been succession arrangements, junior partners designated as Caesar, while the senior emperor bore the title Augustus. But this was different. Marcus was proposing a genuine diarchy, two men with identical formal powers. After some debate, the Senate agreed, and Lucius Verus became Marcus's partner in rule. The two men were different. Lucius was younger, only 30, handsome and charming, fond of pleasure and luxury, not particularly interested in philosophy or administration. He was a military man, or at least fancied himself one, and he enjoyed the trappings of power in ways that Marcus found distasteful. Yet they seem to have worked reasonably well together, at least at first, with Marcus handling most of the day-to-day governance and Lucius taking a more visible role in military matters. But the empire they inherited, despite its appearance of strength and stability, was about to face a series of catastrophes that would test both men to their limits and reveal the fragility of the Pax Romana. The long peace was ending, and Marcus, the reluctant emperor, who wanted only to study philosophy, was about to spend most of his remaining years fighting for the empire's survival. 161. The Roman Empire seemed secure. Its borders were defended by disciplined legions. Its cities were prosperous, its culture thriving. The Antonine emperors, Antoninus Pius and now Marcus Aurelius, had maintained peace and good governance for decades. But appearances can deceive, and the stability of the empire was more fragile than anyone realized. Within months of Marcus and Lucius taking power, that stability would begin to crack. The first crisis came from the east. The Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival beyond the Euphrates, invaded Roman client kingdom of Armenia and then pushed into Syria itself. Parthia and Rome had been competing for dominance in the Near East for over 2 centuries, sometimes through diplomacy and client states, sometimes through outright war. This time, the Parthian king Vologases IV saw an opportunity in the transition of power in Rome and decided to test the new emperors. The invasion was serious. Roman forces in the east were defeated, garrisons were overwhelmed, and the crucial legionary fortress of Elageia in Cappadocia fell to the Parthians. The situation demanded immediate military response, but Marcus, who had no real military experience and was needed in Rome to manage the administration, could not easily leave. Instead, in 162, Lucius Verus was sent east to take command of the war. Lucius established his headquarters at Antioch, the great city in Syria, and nominally commanded the Roman response. In reality, the actual conduct of the war fell to competent generals, Statius Priscus, who campaigned in Armenia, and Avidius Cassius, who led the main invasion of Mesopotamia. These men, professional soldiers with years of experience, conducted a methodical and successful campaign against Parthia. By 165, the tide had turned completely. Roman forces had recaptured Armenia, invaded Mesopotamia, and even sacked Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital. Mesopotamian territory was annexed, Roman prestige was restored, and the war was effectively won. It was a significant military victory, celebrated with triumphal ceremonies when Lucius returned to Rome. On paper, everything looked excellent. But the victory came with a hidden cost that would dwarf any territorial gain. The Roman legions returning from the east brought something with them, something invisible and far more destructive than any Parthian army: disease. What we now call the Antonine Plague, though its exact nature remains debated by historians, was likely either smallpox or measles, and it was absolutely devastating. The epidemic began in the eastern provinces in 165 and spread quickly as troops moved westward. By 166, it had reached Rome itself. Then it spread throughout the empire, following trade routes and military movements, eventually reaching every province from Britain to Egypt. The death toll was catastrophic. Ancient sources, while not providing precise statistics, describe mass deaths, cities struggling to bury their dead, and a profound disruption of social and economic life. Modern historians estimate that the plague killed between 5 and 10 million people, perhaps as much as 10% of the empire's total population. To put this in perspective, imagine 1 out of every 10 people you know simply dying within a few years. The plague hit cities particularly hard, where close quarters facilitated transmission. It killed rich and poor alike, though the wealthy had somewhat more ability to flee to rural estates or isolate themselves. The plague's impact went beyond the immediate death toll. Agricultural production declined as farmers died, leading to food shortages. Tax revenues fell as the tax base shrank. Military recruitment became more difficult. Trade was disrupted. The vitality and optimism that had characterized the Antonine Age gave way to a sense of fragility and fear. And for Marcus, trying to govern through this disaster, the plague was a personal as well as political catastrophe. Lucius Verus himself fell victim to the plague in 169. He died in January of that year, aged only 38, leaving Marcus as sole emperor. Whatever frustrations Marcus may have felt about sharing power with someone so different from himself, Lucius's death was a loss. He had been family, a connection to Marcus's youth and to the careful succession planning of Hadrian and Antoninus. Now Marcus was alone at the top, bearing the full weight of imperial responsibility, without even the limited sharing of burden that the co-emperorship had provided. But there was no time to grieve properly. Even as the plague ravaged the empire, a new and perhaps even more serious threat emerged on the northern frontier. Germanic and Sarmatian tribes along the Danube River, the empire's northern boundary, sensed weakness. Whether they were themselves fleeing pressure from tribes further east, or whether they simply saw an opportunity to invade a plague-weakened empire, the result was the same. In 167, even before Lucius's death, the Marcomanni, Quadi, and other Germanic tribes began to press against the frontier. At first, these were raids, probing attacks, testing Roman responses, but the raids grew bolder and more organized. Multiple tribes began to coordinate their efforts, and they found the Roman defenses, weakened by the plague's impact on military recruitment and morale, less formidable than expected. By 168, the situation had escalated into a full-scale war. The Germanic tribes were not the barbarians of popular imagination, unwashed hordes charging mindlessly at Roman shields. They were sophisticated warrior societies with their own social structures, strategies, and motivations. They had been trading and fighting with Rome for centuries and understood Roman military tactics well. When they attacked, they did so with intelligence and purpose. In 170, the unthinkable happened. Germanic tribes broke through the frontier defenses entirely and invaded Italy itself. They besieged Aquileia, a major city near the head of the Adriatic Sea. This was the first time since Hannibal's invasion during the Second Punic War, nearly 400 years earlier, that hostile foreign forces had penetrated Italy. The psychological shock was profound. Italy was supposed to be inviolable, the heart of the empire, protected by its northern mountain ranges and by legions stationed along the Danube River. That this barrier had been breached suggested that Rome's dominance was not as absolute as everyone had assumed. Marcus, faced with this existential threat, had no choice but to respond personally. In 168, he had already gone north to the Danube frontier to take command of the military response. He would spend most of the rest of his life there, far from Rome, far from his books and philosophical studies, commanding armies and fighting a war that never seemed to end. The Germanic Wars, or the Marcomannic Wars as they are sometimes called, would continue for more than a decade. They were not a single campaign, but a grinding series of battles, sieges, negotiations, treacheries, and fragile truces. The Romans fought not just the Marcomanni and Quadi, but also the Vandals, the Sarmatians, and numerous other tribes. The fighting took place in harsh terrain, thick forests, and frozen rivers, in all seasons and weather conditions. For Marcus, these years must have been a kind of purgatory. Everything he had wanted to avoid, violence, military life, constant travel, and hardship, had become his daily reality. He was not by nature a warrior. He was a scholar, a thinker, someone who believed in reason and self-control and the examined life. Now he found himself presiding over battles where thousands died, managing generals and governors, and dealing with the constant emergencies of wartime. But he had to do it. The Stoics taught that the wise person accepts their role, whatever it may be, and performs it virtuously. Marcus had been given the role of emperor, and being emperor in this crisis meant being a war leader. He could not shirk this responsibility without abandoning millions of people to catastrophe. So he did what he needed to do. He commanded legions, he traveled to the front lines, he endured winter camps and summer campaigns, and he tried, against all the hardship and horror, to maintain his philosophical practice.
It was during these years in military camps along the Danube that Marcus wrote his meditations. In the quiet hours, by lamplight or firelight, he reflected on the principles that sustained him. He reminded himself of Stoic teachings, wrote down observations about human nature and mortality, tried to process the suffering he witnessed and the difficult decisions he had to make. These private notes, never intended for publication, would become one of the most famous works of philosophy ever written. But that was far in the future. For now, they were simply survival tools, ways of keeping his sanity and his integrity intact when everything around him was chaos and death. The plague continued through these years, flaring up periodically and carrying off soldiers and civilians alike. Marcus himself fell ill at times, struggling with the same chronic health problems that would plague him throughout his life. Sources describe him as having stomach troubles and weakness, possibly exacerbated by the stress and hardship of the campaigns. Yet he persisted, day after day, season after season, year after year. He remained with the army,
doing his duty, trying to save an empire that sometimes seemed determined to fall apart. By 175, after years of grinding warfare, the situation had stabilized somewhat. The Romans had pushed the invaders back across the Danube, re-established control of the frontier, and even begun to plan for the creation of new provinces in Germania that would push the empire's borders further north and create a more defensible frontier. Marcus seemed to be winning, though the cost in lives and treasure had been enormous. But then, in that same year, a new crisis erupted, this time from within. Avidius Cassius, the general who had been so successful in the Parthian War and who was now serving as governor in the east, declared himself emperor. The sources are unclear about exactly why this happened. Some claim that false rumors of Marcus's death reached the east and that Cassius, believing the throne vacant, acted to prevent chaos. Others suggest that Faustina, Marcus's wife, fearing for her position and her children if Marcus died, encouraged Cassius to seize power. Still others believe Cassius was simply ambitious and saw an opportunity. Whatever the motivation, the rebellion was serious. Cassius controlled the wealthy and populous eastern provinces. He commanded loyal legions, and he had a reputation as a capable military commander. Rome could easily have been plunged into civil war. Marcus, despite being engaged in the northern campaigns, had to respond. He prepared to march east and confront the usurper. But before the confrontation could occur, Cassius was assassinated by his own officers, who apparently had second thoughts about rebelling against a generally respected emperor. The rebellion collapsed, and Marcus was able to avoid a civil war. He traveled to the east anyway, to reassure the provinces of his authority and to investigate what had happened. He treated the situation with remarkable clemency, pardoning most of those involved and showing none of the vindictiveness that might have been expected. This clemency, this refusal to engage in the kind of bloody purges that often followed failed rebellions, was characteristic of Marcus. His Stoic principles taught him that anger and vengeance were passions to be controlled, that the wise person responded to wrongdoing with reason rather than emotion. He believed that people acted wrongly out of ignorance, not malice, and that the appropriate response was education and correction, not punishment. His treatment of the Cassius affair demonstrated these principles in practice, though one wonders at what personal cost, given that some of those pardoned had participated in a rebellion that could have destroyed everything he was trying to preserve. Faustina died during this trip to the east in 176. She was only 45 years old. The cause of her death is unknown, possibly illness, possibly complications from childbirth, her youngest daughter, Vibia Aurelia Sabina, having been born not long before. Marcus grieved, but tried to do so philosophically, accepting her death as one of the indifferents, something not in his control, and therefore not something that should disturb his equanimity. He had her deified, established a charitable fund for orphaned girls in her memory, and continued his duties. By 177, Marcus was back in Rome briefly before returning north to resume the Germanic campaigns. The war was not over. New invasions required new responses, and Marcus, now in his mid-50s, in poor health, grieving the loss of his wife, exhausted by years of campaigning, had to go back to the Danube frontier and continue fighting. The burden never lifted, the duty never ended, and through it all, he tried to maintain his philosophical practice, to remain virtuous, to do what needed to be done without complaint or resentment. The world had broken. The Pax Romana, that long peace that had seemed so secure, had revealed itself as temporary. Plague, invasion, rebellion, death, these had become the normal conditions of imperial life. And Marcus, the philosopher who never wanted to rule, found himself fighting desperately just to hold things together, to prevent complete collapse, to preserve something of civilization and order for the people who depended on him. He did not give up. He did not abdicate or flee into private life or lose himself in despair. He simply continued, day after exhausting day, doing his duty as he understood it, trying to be the kind of person his philosophy taught him to be. It was not glorious. There were no great triumphs, no clear victories that solved everything. It was just endurance, persistence, the stubborn determination to keep going when every reason suggested stopping. And in that persistence, in that refusal to abandon his post no matter how difficult things became, Marcus demonstrated what Stoic virtue looked like in practice, not as an abstract ideal, but as a lived reality.
Somewhere along the Danube frontier, in a military camp far from the comforts of Rome, Marcus Aurelius sat with a manuscript before him. The papyrus or parchment, worn from use and handling, contained his private thoughts, observations, and reminders that he had been recording for years. He wrote in Greek, not Latin, the language he associated with philosophy and deep thought, though Latin was his native tongue and the language of Roman power. This choice itself tells us something about how he viewed these writings, not as public documents or imperial pronouncements, but as intimate philosophical exercises. What we call the Meditations, Marcus himself apparently called To Himself, or Things to Himself, a title that captures the work's essence perfectly. These were not essays meant to persuade others, or treatises systematically laying out a philosophical system. They were reminders, notes to himself about how to live, how to think, how to respond to the difficult circumstances that surrounded him. They were spiritual exercises, attempts to reinforce and internalize the Stoic principles he had learned decades earlier as a young man fascinated by philosophy. The work is divided into 12 books, though books is perhaps too formal a term for what are really sections or collections of notes. The first book is unique, a long list of people Marcus was grateful to and what he learned from each of them. His grandfather taught him about good character and controlling anger. His mother taught him about generosity and simplicity and piety. Rusticus, one of his philosophy teachers, taught him not to be distracted by rhetoric and to read carefully. Apollonius taught him about freedom and steady purpose. Sextus taught him about kindness and the idea of a community based on equality and free speech. The list goes on, thanking teacher after teacher, family member after family member, even the Emperor Antoninus Pius, who receives an extended tribute for the many qualities Marcus learned from observing him. This first book is deeply personal and moving, showing us a man who, despite all his power and all his hardships, remained grateful for the people who had shaped him and conscious that he was part of a long chain of human connection and obligation. The remaining 11 books contain individual reflections, some only a sentence or two, others extending to several paragraphs. They seem to have been written at different times and in no particular order, jotted down as thoughts occurred to Marcus, or as he needed to remind himself of particular principles. Some entries are almost meditative in their calm. Others feel urgent, as if Marcus was struggling in that moment with difficult emotions or circumstances and writing to regain his composure. A constant theme throughout the Meditations is mortality. Marcus returns again and again to the shortness of life, the inevitability of death, and the importance of not wasting the limited time we have. You could leave life right now, he tells himself.
Let that determine what you do and say and think. This is not morbid obsession, but rather a technique the Stoics called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. By constantly reminding yourself that you will die, that you could die today, you gain perspective on what really matters and what is trivial. Think of yourself as dead, he writes at one point. You have lived your life. Now take what's left and live it properly. The time that has passed is gone, irrecoverable. The time that remains, whether days or decades, is what you still have control over. How will you use it? Will you waste it on things that don't matter, on anger and resentment and petty concerns? Or will you live virtuously, rationally, in accordance with nature? Another persistent theme is the interconnectedness of all things. Marcus, following Stoic physics, believed that everything is part of one substance, constantly changing form, but never created or destroyed. The atoms that compose your body today were once part of the earth, plants, animals, other humans. When you die, those atoms will disperse and become part of other things. Nothing is truly separate. Everything is interconnected in an endless dance of transformation. From this perspective, death loses much of its terror. You are not being destroyed, but simply changing form, returning to the elements from which you came, contributing your substance to the ongoing life of the cosmos. As Marcus puts it, frightened of change, but what can exist without it? What's closer to nature's heart? Can you take a hot bath unless the wood undergoes a change? Can you be nourished without the food undergoing a change? And can anything useful be done without change? The Meditations also contain numerous observations about human nature, often with a touch of weary wisdom. Marcus had spent years watching people, understanding their motivations, their flaws, their capacity for both good and evil. He knew that people often act badly not out of malice, but out of ignorance or confusion about what is truly good. As a Stoic, he believed that everyone naturally seeks what they think is good for themselves, but most people are mistaken about what is actually good, confusing pleasure or wealth or honor with genuine well-being. When you wake up in the morning, one famous passage begins. Tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. This might sound cynical, but Marcus's point is not to condemn humanity, but to prepare himself mentally for the inevitable difficulties of human interaction. And he immediately follows this catalog of human faults by noting that these people act this way because they don't know better, because they can't distinguish good from evil. They are like this because they can't tell good from evil, he writes. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own. This recognition that even the worst people share our common humanity leads Marcus to one of his most important practical principles, not to hate or despise those who wrong us, but to work with them patiently, to correct them if possible, to accept their flaws while not being corrupted by them. Be tolerant with others and strict with yourself, he advises. This is not weakness, but strength, the ability to maintain your own standards while not demanding that others meet them.
Again and again, Marcus reminds himself that he cannot control what others do, only how he responds. This is the fundamental Stoic distinction that gives the philosophy its practical power. External events, what happens to you, are beyond your control and therefore should not disturb you. What is in your control is your judgment, your reaction, your choice about how to interpret and respond to events. No one can force you to become angry, upset, or fearful.
These are choices you make based on your judgments about what has happened. If you are distressed by anything external, Marcus writes, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And this you have the power to revoke at any moment. This doesn't mean pretending that bad things are good or engaging in self-deception. It means understanding that calling something bad or catastrophic or unbearable is a judgment that you are making, and that you could make a different judgment. You could see the same event as simply something that happened, neutral in itself, an opportunity to practice virtue rather than a disaster that destroys your happiness. The imagery Marcus uses throughout the Meditations often draws on military experience. He speaks of the mind as an inner citadel that cannot be captured unless you surrender it, of maintaining your post even when under attack, of the philosopher as a kind of spiritual soldier serving in the army of reason. But he also uses gentler images, the bending of a branch that returns to its natural position, the flow of water that adapts to whatever channel it finds, the growth of plants that neither hurry nor delay, but simply unfold according to their nature. One of the most moving aspects of the Meditations is how it reveals Marcus's struggles. This is not the work of someone for whom philosophy came easily, who had achieved some permanent state of wisdom and serenity. It is the work of someone constantly battling his own weaknesses, his own frustrations and discouragements, his own very human desires for things to be different than they are. He has to keep reminding himself of basic principles because he keeps forgetting them under pressure. He has to keep talking himself through difficult situations because his natural reactions are not always virtuous. How much more harmful are the consequences of anger and grief than the circumstances that arouse them in us, he notes, as if discovering this truth anew. You have power over your mind, not outside events, he reminds himself, as if he has temporarily lost sight of this fundamental Stoic teaching and needs to recover it. The repetition, the circling back to the same themes and ideas, shows us a man engaged in ongoing spiritual work, not someone who has finished the work and achieved enlightenment. There is also, running through the Meditations, a vein of something like loneliness or weariness. Marcus was, by all accounts, surrounded by people constantly, advisors and generals and courtiers and family members. Yet the philosophical life, as he understood it, was fundamentally solitary. No one else could do the work of examining your own mind and correcting your own judgments. And Marcus, bearing responsibilities that no one else could share, making decisions that affected millions, must have felt profoundly isolated. Nowhere can a man find a quieter or more troubled retreat than in his own soul, he writes, and you can feel the longing for that inner refuge, that place of peace unreachable by external chaos. The Meditations themselves were perhaps his way of creating that inner sanctuary, of stepping back from the overwhelming demands of his position and reconnecting with the philosophical principles that gave his life meaning and direction. Marcus also reflects on the transience of all things, including fame and legacy. He notes how quickly even the greatest names are forgotten, how emperors and philosophers who seemed so important in their own time have faded into obscurity. What seemed like immortal fame endures for perhaps a few generations, perhaps a century or two, and then even that is gone. The stones weather, the inscriptions fade, and eventually no one remembers. This might seem pessimistic, but for Marcus it was liberating. If fame is temporary, if nothing we build or accomplish will last forever, then we should not be so attached to these things or so devastated when they fail. What matters is not whether we are remembered, but whether we live virtuously while we are alive. The universe will continue its endless cycles long after we are forgotten, and that is as it should be. Our job is not to achieve immortality, but to play our role well in the time we have. Yet there is also beauty in the meditations, moments when Marcus's appreciation for the wonder of existence shines through his Stoic discipline. He notes the way even the imperfections of natural things have their own kind of beauty, how bread cracks open when baking, how olives are most beautiful when they are almost overripe, how a lion's furrowed brow and the foam from a boar's mouth, while not beautiful in themselves, are beautiful as parts of the natural processes that produce them. He reminds himself to pay attention to what is right in front of him, to find the divine reason working itself out in everyday events and objects. The universe is not divided between the sacred and the profane, the philosophical and the mundane. Everything that exists is part of the same universal nature, governed by the same reason, worthy of the same careful attention. The trick is to see it, to notice it, to wake up to the marvel of existence that continues whether we pay attention or not. As we read the Meditations today, we're essentially looking over Marcus's shoulder at his private spiritual exercises, witnessing the internal dialogue of a man trying to be good in difficult circumstances. The work was never finished, never revised for publication, never given the kind of polish that Marcus might have applied if he had intended others to read it. It ends abruptly in the middle of Book 12, as if Marcus simply stopped writing, perhaps because he died, perhaps because the demands of the moment pulled him from his manuscript. That incompleteness, that sense of ongoing process never concluded, is part of what makes the Meditations so powerful and so relatable. Marcus did not solve the problems of existence. He did not achieve perfect wisdom or permanent tranquility. He struggled, he doubted, he had to keep reminding himself of truths he kept forgetting, and yet he kept trying. He kept returning to his philosophical practice, kept examining himself, kept striving to be better than he was. In those scattered notes, written by firelight in military camps while barbarians gathered beyond the perimeter and plague ravaged the empire, Marcus Aurelius left behind something more enduring than any of his military victories or political achievements. He left a record of what it looks like to try to live philosophically under the worst conditions, to maintain your humanity when everything conspires to degrade it, to keep faith with principles of wisdom and virtue when the easiest thing would be to abandon them and simply exercise power as you pleased. The words were written in darkness, both literal and figurative, but they have carried light across the centuries to anyone who has ever struggled with duty they did not choose, with circumstances beyond their control, with the gap between who they want to be and who they are. Marcus wrote to himself, but in doing so, he wrote to all of us.
To stand at the head of armies, to watch men march toward death on your orders, to make decisions about life and annihilation for thousands, this was never what Marcus Aurelius wanted. He was a scholar, a thinker, someone who believed that the examined life was the highest calling. But fate, or providence, or simply the machinery of Roman succession had placed him in a position where philosophical contemplation had to coexist with military command, where the life of the mind had to make room for the necessities of war. The Germanic wars that dominated Marcus's reign were not a single conflict, but a grinding series of campaigns that stretched across more than a decade. The enemies were primarily the Marcomanni, who had settled in what is now Bohemia and Bavaria, and the Quadi, positioned to their east in regions corresponding to modern Slovakia and parts of Hungary. These were not disorganized barbarian hordes, but structured warrior societies with their own leaders, strategies, and motivations.
They had been trading partners and sometimes allies of Rome for generations. They understood Roman military tactics, had observed Roman strengths and weaknesses, and when they decided to strike, they did so with coordination and purpose. The initial Roman response to the invasions had been hampered by the weakening of frontier defenses. To gather forces for the Parthian War in the east, Marcus had been forced to slim down troops along the European frontier, the long boundary roughly marked by the Rhine and Danube rivers. He had warned local governors against provoking the borderland tribes, knowing how vulnerable the reduced garrisons made the frontier. But warnings were not enough. The Marcomanni broke their alliance with Rome and launched a serious invasion across the Danube in 166. Marcus, unlike emperors such as Hadrian, who had spent years campaigning in the provinces, was relatively inexperienced in expeditionary warfare. His training had been administrative and philosophical, not military, yet duty demanded that he act. He left Rome and stationed himself in what is now Serbia and Austria, attempting to coordinate the defense and mount a counteroffensive. The early campaigns did not go well. Marcus suffered 2 defeats, and the situation deteriorated further. By 170, or perhaps as early as 167, depending on which historians you believe, Germanic tribes accomplished something that had not happened in over 2.5 centuries. They crossed the Alps and invaded Italy itself. The siege of Aquileia, a major city near the head of the Adriatic Sea, sent shockwaves through the Roman world. Italy was supposed to be inviolable, the heart of the empire, protected by mountains and by the strength of the legions stationed on the frontiers. That foreign invaders had reached this far south, had actually besieged a Roman city on Italian soil, shattered assumptions that many Romans had held their entire lives. The psychological impact was immense. If Italy could be invaded, if Rome itself was potentially threatened, then what did Roman power actually mean? Marcus had to respond with every resource available. The financial strain was enormous. To fund the war effort, he took the extraordinary step of auctioning off imperial property, selling treasures from the palace, valuable artifacts, even personal belongings of previous emperors. The historian Michael Kulikowski describes this as the only viable alternative to raising taxes on a population already burdened by plague and economic disruption. It was a measure born of desperation, but it worked. The money raised helped fund the recruitment of new troops, the supply of existing legions, and the fortification of defenses. Marcus also had to be creative in recruitment. With plague having decimated the population and normal recruitment channels strained, he began enlisting slaves, gladiators, and even criminals to serve in the legions. This was not standard Roman practice. The legions had traditionally been composed of Roman citizens or trusted auxiliary troops from allied peoples, men with a stake in the empire's survival. To bring in slaves and criminals showed both the desperation of the situation and Marcus's pragmatic determination to defend the empire by whatever means necessary. Command was entrusted to capable generals, particularly Tiberius Claudius Pompeianus, Marcus's son-in-law, and Pertinax, who would briefly become emperor years later. A new defensive zone called the Praetentura Italiae ad Alpium was established to safeguard northern Italy. The Danube fleet was strengthened. Slowly, methodically, the Romans pushed back. Aquileia was relieved. By late 171, the invading forces had been expelled from Roman territory. But expelling the invaders was not enough. To prevent future invasions, the Romans needed to take the fight to the enemy. In 172, Roman forces crossed the Danube into Marcomannic territory. The campaign achieved success, subduing the Marcomanni and their allies, including tribes called the Naristi and the Cotini.
Marcus adopted the victory title Germanicus, and coins were minted with the inscription Germania Copta, Germania conquered. For a moment, it seemed the crisis might be ending. Then came in 173, the Romans campaigned against the Quadi, who had broken their treaty and assisted their allies. It was during this campaign that one of the most famous and mysterious episodes of Marcus's wars occurred, the so-called rain miracle. According to the contemporary historian Cassius Dio, a Roman legion, the 12th Fulminata, was surrounded by a superior Quadi force and was on the verge of forced to surrender because of heat and thirst. Then suddenly, a tremendous thunderstorm broke over the battlefield. Rain fell in torrents, allowing the parched Roman soldiers to drink and regain their strength. At the same time, lightning struck among the Quadi forces, throwing them into disorder. The Romans, refreshed and inspired by what seemed to be divine intervention, attacked and won the battle. The event was later depicted on the column of Marcus Aurelius and commemorated on coins. Different groups claimed credit for the miracle. Some said it was the result of prayers by Marcus himself to the traditional Roman gods. Christians in the legion claimed that their prayers to the Christian god had brought the rain. Egyptian priests of the god Thoth, who accompanied the army, said their rituals had summoned the storm. Whatever the explanation, whether genuine divine intervention, fortunate meteorology, or some combination, the event became legendary. It demonstrated how desperate the fighting had become, how closely survival could hinge on unexpected events, and how people in crisis turned to supernatural explanations for their deliverance. After the victory over the Quadi, Roman attention turned to the Iazij, a Sarmatian people living in the plain of the Tisa River in what is now Hungary. After several victories, in 175, a treaty was signed. The Iazij king, Xanthicus, delivered 100,000 Roman prisoners, a staggering number that gives some sense of how many Romans had been captured during the years of warfare. Additionally, the Iazij provided 8,000 auxiliary cavalrymen to serve Rome, with 5,500 of them being sent all the way to Britain, as far from their homeland as possible, to prevent desertion or rebellion. Marcus assumed the victory title Sarmaticus, and it appeared that the wars might finally be ending. Marcus seems to have had ambitious plans. He intended to create two new Roman provinces, Marcomannia and Sarmatia, incorporating conquered Germanic and Sarmatian territories into the empire and pushing the frontier northward to create a more defensible border. Fortifications were planned, administrative structures were being designed, and the dream of finally securing the northern frontier seemed within reach. But then came the rebellion of Avidius Cassius, the general who had been so successful in the Parthian War, and who now served as governor in the east. In 175, false rumors reached the eastern provinces that Marcus had died. Cassius, whether acting out of ambition or, as some sources claim, at the urging of Faustina, who feared for her children's position if Marcus died without a clear succession, declared himself emperor. Syria, Palestine, and Egypt recognized him, and suddenly Marcus faced the prospect of civil war. Marcus had to suspend the northern campaigns and march east with his army to confront the usurper. But before the confrontation could occur, Cassius was assassinated by his own officers, men apparently who had second thoughts on rebelling against an emperor who was generally respected and who still commanded significant military force. The rebellion collapsed as quickly as it had begun.
Marcus's response to the failed rebellion demonstrated his philosophical principles in action. Rather than ordering wholesale executions and confiscations, rather than terrorizing the eastern provinces into loyalty through fear, he showed remarkable clemency. He pardoned most of those involved, understanding that many had been swept up in events not of their making,
or had been misled by false information. Only the ringleaders faced punishment, and even then Marcus tried to limit the bloodshed. It was a Stoic response, controlled, rational, focused on restoring order rather than satisfying vengeance. But the rebellion had consequences beyond its immediate resolution. The interruption it caused allowed tribal hostilities along the Danube to flare up again. The progress Marcus had made, the plans for new provinces, the hope of finally establishing lasting peace, all of this was set back. The tribes sensed Roman distraction and weakness, and they renewed their attacks. Marcus had to return north and begin the grinding work of pacification all over again. It was during this period, these long years of campaigning, from 177 to 180, that Marcus was most prolific in his philosophical writing. The Meditations, or most of them at least, seem to have been written during these final campaigns. In military camps along the Danube, in winter quarters when active campaigning was impossible, in brief moments of quiet between crises, Marcus wrote. He reflected on mortality, on duty, on how to maintain one's humanity in inhuman circumstances, on what it meant to be good when everything around you was violence and chaos. The physical conditions were harsh. Winter along the Danube could be brutal, with freezing temperatures and snow. Summer brought heat, insects, and the constant threat of disease. Food supplies were sometimes uncertain. The enemy was always near, always dangerous, and Marcus, now in his 50s, was not in good health. Ancient sources describe him as suffering from chronic stomach troubles and general weakness, conditions likely exacerbated by the stress and hardship of years of campaigning. Yet he persisted. Day after day he fulfilled his duties. He met with generals, reviewed strategy, adjudicated disputes, made decisions about supplies and deployments and diplomatic overtures. He maintained the administrative work of the empire, even from the frontier, receiving reports from provinces, issuing edicts, managing the vast machinery of Roman governments. And somehow, in the midst of all this, he found time to write, to examine his own soul, to try to understand how to live well when living well seemed almost impossible. The wars ground on. The Romans won battles and lost battles. They pushed the enemy back and then had to do it again when new invasions came. They negotiated treaties that held for a while and then broke down. It was not the kind of warfare celebrated in triumphal arches and victory columns, not glorious conquest, but exhausting defense, not expansion, but survival. And Marcus bore the weight of it, the knowledge that thousands of lives depended on his decisions, that if he failed, if Roman defenses collapsed, the consequences would be catastrophic for millions. In 178, Marcus arrived at Carnuntum on the Danube to resume active command. He first moved against the Marcomanni, then against the Quadi from 179 to 180. The fighting continued season after season, and there was no end in sight. Marcus's health was deteriorating further. He was approaching 60 years old, ancient by Roman standards, and he had spent nearly 2 decades bearing the burden of command during some of the most challenging years in Roman history. Those who served with him saw an emperor unlike any other. Marcus did not glory in war, did not celebrate violence, did not seem to take pleasure in conquest. He did what was necessary because duty required it, because millions depended on the empire's protection, because there was no one else to do it. His generals and advisors could see that he was wearing down, that the years of stress and hardship and responsibility were taking their toll. But he never complained, never asked to be relieved, never suggested that someone else should carry the burden he had been given. The Stoic philosophy that he had embraced as a young man sustained him through these impossible years. The disciplines he had practiced, the constant examination of his thoughts and judgments, the determination to maintain virtue regardless of circumstances. These were not abstract intellectual exercises. They were survival tools, ways of maintaining sanity and integrity when everything around you was violence and chaos. As 180 dawned, Marcus was still with the army, still fighting the Germanic tribes, still trying to secure the frontier and create lasting peace. He had been emperor for nearly 19 years, almost all of them spent in crisis. The plague had devastated the empire. Invasions had breached defenses that were supposed to be impregnable. Rebellion had erupted in the east. His wife had died. Many of his children had died. Everything that could go wrong had gone wrong, and yet he had held on, had kept the empire together, had maintained his philosophical practice and his sense of duty through it all. He could not have known that his time was running out, that all his plans for securing the frontier would be abandoned by his successor, that the hard-won gains of years of warfare would be thrown away almost immediately. He could only keep doing what he had always done, his duty, as he understood it, to the best of his ability, without complaint or resentment, trying to be the kind of person his philosophy taught him to be. The weight of command had never lifted. It had only grown heavier as the years passed, but Marcus carried it until he could carry it no longer, and in that persistence, in that refusal to abandon his post, no matter the cost, he demonstrated what it meant to be a philosopher, not just in words, but in life itself.
Among all the decisions Marcus Aurelius made during his reign, none would prove more consequential or more debated than his choice regarding succession. For over 80 years, from the reign of Nerva in 96 through the death of Antoninus Pius in 161, Rome had been governed by the so-called 5 good emperors, men who had been chosen for their ability rather than their bloodline. Each emperor had adopted a capable successor, usually a mature man with proven administrative and military skill. It was a system that had produced nearly a century of relative stability and good governance. Marcus Aurelius broke that pattern. When he died in 180, he was succeeded not by an adopted heir chosen for competence, but by his biological son, Commodus, who was only 18 years old and who would become one of Rome's most notorious emperors. To many later historians, this decision marked the end of Rome's golden age, the beginning of the decline that would eventually lead to the empire's fall. The question that has echoed across the centuries is simple. Why did Marcus, the philosopher emperor, the man of wisdom and virtue, choose Commodus? Commodus was born on August 31st, 161, in Lanuvium, a small town near Rome, just months after Marcus and Lucius Verus had become co-emperors. He was the 12th of at least 13 children born to Marcus and Faustina the Younger. Of these children, many died in infancy or childhood. Marcus and Faustina had 7 sons in total, but Commodus was the only one who survived to adulthood. His twin brother died at age 4. Another brother died following a surgical operation when Commodus was 8 years old. By the time Marcus was seriously planning for succession, Commodus was his only surviving male heir. From an early age, Commodus was groomed for power. At age 5, he was given the title Caesar, marking him as heir apparent. At 15, following the rebellion of Avidius Cassius, Marcus appointed him consul, making Commodus the youngest person ever to hold that office. At 16, in 177, Commodus was elevated to co-emperor, sharing the title Augustus with his father. This rapid elevation was partly about cementing stability after the rebellion had demonstrated the dangers of uncertain succession, and partly about ensuring smooth transition if Marcus, whose health had never been robust, should die unexpectedly. But what was Commodus actually like?
The historical sources, written after his death and colored by his later actions, paint a picture of someone very different from his father. Where Marcus loved philosophy and intellectual pursuits, Commodus was passionate about sports, hunting, and gladiatorial combat. Where Marcus showed restraint and self-discipline, Commodus displayed impulsivity and self-indulgence. Where Marcus sought to serve the state, Commodus seemed to view the emperorship as an opportunity for personal gratification. Yet we must be careful about accepting these characterizations uncritically. Much of what we know about Commodus comes from hostile sources written by senators and historians who had reason to portray him negatively. The Historia Augusta, one of our main sources, is notoriously unreliable, often mixing fact with fiction and gossip. Cassius Dio and Herodian, while more trustworthy, still wrote from the perspective of the senatorial class that Commodus alienated during his reign. What seems clear is that Commodus was not interested in the aspects of rule that Marcus had emphasized: careful administration, philosophical reflection, personal modesty, subordination of self to duty. Whether these differences were apparent when Commodus was young, or whether they only emerged later when he had power, is impossible to determine with certainty. Some sources suggest Marcus was aware of problems in his son's character, but felt he had no choice. Others argue that the negative aspects of Commodus's personality only fully developed after Marcus's death, when no one could restrain him anymore. So why did Marcus choose Commodus? The most straightforward answer is that he had little choice. In the Roman world, wealth and power were connected with family in ways that made it nearly impossible for an emperor with a surviving son to pass over that son in favor of an adopted heir. Imperial wealth was divided between the private property of the emperor and the public treasury, and much of this wealth was linked to the imperial family rather than the position of emperor itself. To exclude Commodus from succession would have meant effectively disinheriting him, stripping him of his position and wealth while he was still alive. The consequences of such a decision would have been catastrophic. As the biographer Frank McLean notes, once Commodus survived infancy, Marcus was faced with a stark choice: make him heir or kill him. There was no middle ground. If Marcus had adopted another successor while Commodus lived, Commodus would have become a focal point for rebellion and civil war. Those who resented the new emperor, those who felt passed over for advancement, those who simply sought power, all would have rallied to Commodus as the legitimate heir who had been wronged. Rome would have been plunged into the kind of civil conflict that had plagued it in earlier eras, with rival armies fighting for competing claimants to the throne.
Even if Commodus himself had not sought power, his mere existence would have been destabilizing. The new emperor, knowing that a possible rival existed, would have felt compelled to eliminate the threat, either through assassination or forced suicide. Commodus, aware that his life was in danger, might have struck first. The result would have been bloodshed, instability, and quite possibly years of civil war. When Constantine excluded his own son from succession in 306, the result was 18 years of devastating civil conflict that nearly tore the empire apart. Marcus, as a Stoic, would have viewed murdering his own son as deeply unethical. The Stoics taught that all human beings share a common rationality, that we are all, in a sense, family, members of a cosmic community. To kill your own child for political expediency would violate everything Marcus believed about virtue, justice, and human dignity. Even if he suspected that Commodus might not be a good emperor, he could not bring himself to commit what he would have seen as an act of profound evil to prevent a hypothetical future harm. There's also the question of what Marcus actually knew about Commodus's character and what he could have reasonably predicted. Commodus was young,
still in his teens during the years when Marcus was making these decisions. Young people change. Teenagers who seem irresponsible sometimes mature into capable adults. Marcus may have hoped that time, education, and the weight of responsibility would shape Commodus into a better ruler. He provided his son with excellent tutors and included him in military campaigns, giving him experience in governance and warfare. Some historians suggest that Marcus made Commodus co-emperor not because he thought Commodus was ready, but precisely because he wasn't. By sharing power while Marcus still lived, Commodus could learn by doing, could be guided and corrected, could be prepared for sole rule gradually, rather than being thrust into it suddenly upon Marcus's death. This interpretation sees the co-emperorship as an extended apprenticeship, similar to Marcus's own long preparation under Antoninus Pius. We should also consider the context of Marcus's final years. He was fighting a grinding war on the Danube frontier, dealing with constant military crises, working to establish new provinces and secure lasting peace about the turbulent regions beyond the Danube. All of this was abandoned. Commodus wanted to return to Rome to enjoy the pleasures and powers of his position, and he was willing to sacrifice his father's strategic objectives to do so. Back in Rome, Commodus showed little interest in the practical work of governance. He delegated practical administration to a series of favorites and freedmen, focusing his own attention on gladiatorial games, personal indulgence, and the creation of an increasingly bizarre personality cult. He styled himself as the reincarnation of Hercules, had statues erected showing himself in a lion's skin, carrying a club, and eventually began performing as a gladiator in the Colosseum, actions that horrified the senatorial class. Commodus's reign saw numerous conspiracies and attempted coups, which in turn provoked him to increasingly dictatorial and paranoid responses. He ordered executions of senators and others he perceived as threats, confiscated property to fund his lavish lifestyle, and ruled through fear rather than the cooperation that had characterized his father's reign. After 12 years of growing instability, Commodus was assassinated in 192, strangled by a wrestler after a poison attempt failed. His death was followed by civil war, the year of the 5 emperors, and the beginning of a period of military emperors and frequent violent successions that contrasted sharply with the stability of the Antonine age. Later historians, looking back, saw Marcus's choice of Commodus as the moment when Rome's golden age ended. Cassius Dio, writing not long after these events, ended his account of Marcus's reign with a lament. Marcus did not meet with the good fortune that he deserved, for he was not strong in body and was involved in a multitude of troubles throughout practically his entire reign. But for my part, I admire him all the more for this very reason, that amid unusual and extraordinary difficulties, he both survived himself and preserved the empire. The poignancy of Marcus's situation is undeniable. Here was a man who did everything right, who had dedicated himself to virtue and duty, who had endured hardship and personal loss with stoic equanimity, who defended the empire through years of plague and war, who wrote some of the wisest words ever set down about how to live well, and yet his decision about succession, constrained by circumstances beyond his control and ethical principles that forbade him from simply eliminating a problematic heir, led to consequences that undermined much of what he had worked to preserve. This is perhaps the most profoundly Stoic aspect of Marcus's story. The Stoics taught that we cannot control outcomes, only our own choices and actions. We can do everything right and still face disaster. What matters is not whether we succeed in achieving our desired results, but whether we act virtuously in our efforts. Marcus made the best choice available to him given his values, his circumstances, and the information he had. That the choice led to poor outcomes does not negate the virtue of his reasoning or the integrity of his intentions. The shadow that Commodus cast over Marcus's legacy raises questions that extend beyond ancient Rome. What is a leader's responsibility when they must choose a successor? How much can we really know about how young people will develop? When do practical considerations outweigh ideal preferences? How do we balance different kinds of risks when all choices involve uncertainty? These are questions without clear answers, questions that every leader in every era must grapple with.
The End of Days, March 17, 180. The place is Vindobona, a military outpost along the Danube that would one day become the city of Vienna. Inside one of the buildings, perhaps the commander's quarters of the legionary fortress, perhaps a specially constructed imperial residence, Marcus Aurelius lies dying. He is 58 years old, which is a respectable age for the time, but not extraordinarily so. Antoninus Pius had lived to 74, but Marcus had not lived an easy life. The years of stress, the campaigns in harsh conditions, the chronic health problems that had plagued him, the grief of losing so many children, the weight of responsibility that never lifted, all of this had worn him down. The cause of his death is not entirely clear from the ancient sources. Some suggest plague, which would be fitting in a grim way, given that the Antonine plague had dominated so much of his reign. Others mention a fever or illness contracted during the campaign. Still others simply say that his body gave out, that he died of exhaustion and old age. What seems certain is that he knew the end was coming, that he had time to prepare, to say what needed to be said, to try to ensure as smooth a transition as possible. Commodus was with him, the son who was about to become sole emperor, who would soon make decisions that abandoned his father's plans and turned away from his father's principles, stood at the bedside, watching the philosopher emperor slip away. What passed between them in those final moments we do not know. The sources give us fragments, possible last words, reported conversations, but these may be as much legend as history. According to some accounts, Marcus urged those around him not to weep for him. Death was natural, he reminded them, part of the universal process of change that governs all things. He had taught this in his meditations, written it down again and again. Death is not something to fear, but simply a transition, the atoms that compose us returning to the universal substance, playing their role in the endless dance of transformation. If he truly believed these things, and his writings suggest he did, then his own approaching death was just another opportunity to practice what he had preached, to accept what was beyond his control with equanimity. He reportedly told the soldiers to focus on Commodus, to go to the rising sun, while he himself was setting. This poetic farewell suggests acceptance, a sense of the natural cycle of generations, the old making way for the new. Whether he felt genuine confidence in Commodus or was simply trying to ensure a smooth transition by publicly endorsing his successor, we cannot know. What we do know is that he chose his last words carefully, trying to shape how people would remember this moment and how they would approach what came next. On March 17th, Marcus Aurelius died. The empire that he had defended for nearly 19 years, that he had held together through plague and invasion and rebellion, that he had tried to govern according to philosophical principles of reason and virtue, now passed to his son. The Senate immediately voted to deify Marcus, making him officially a god of the Roman state, worshipped in temples alongside Jupiter and Mars and the other deified emperors. It was a recognition of his virtues, his dedication, his service to Rome.
But deification could not change what happened next. Commodus, now sole emperor at age 18, wasted little time in demonstrating his different priorities. The Germanic wars that had dominated his father's final years were hastily concluded. Commodus negotiated treaties that, while they maintained nominal Roman dominance, gave up the strategic objectives Marcus had been working toward. The plans for new provinces of Marcomania and Sarmatia were abandoned. The dream of pushing the frontier north to create a more defensible border, of establishing permanent Roman control over the Germanic territories, of solving the northern frontier problem once and for all, this dream died with Marcus. On October 22, 180, just 7 months after his father's death, Commodus celebrated a triumph in Rome for the conclusion of the Germanic wars. It was a traditional Roman ceremony, a parade through the city displaying captives and spoils, the general or emperor riding in a chariot dressed as Jupiter, the crowds cheering, the Senate processing behind. It was meant to mark a great victory, but those who had served under Marcus, who knew what the wars had actually been like, must have felt something hollow about the celebration. The wars were not truly won, they were simply ended, abandoned as soon as convenience suggested doing so. Commodus's lack of interest in administration became immediately apparent. He left the practical running of the state to a succession of favorites, beginning with Saoterus, a freedman from Nicomedia who had been his chamberlain. Real power flowed not from the emperor's deliberative judgment, but from whoever currently had his ear, whoever could influence him in his private chambers. This was a dramatic contrast to Marcus, who had involved himself deeply in governance, who had read reports, adjudicated legal cases, made careful decisions based on consultation and reflection. The shift in Rome's governance style had immediate consequences. The senatorial order, accustomed to having at least some voice in imperial policy under Marcus, found themselves sidelined and ignored under Commodus. Conspiracies began almost immediately. In 182, just 2 years into his sole reign, Commodus's own sister Lucilla was involved in a plot to assassinate him. The plot failed, and Commodus's response was to become more paranoid, more isolated, more dependent on bodyguards and informers. Over the next decade, Commodus's behavior became increasingly erratic and autocratic. He surrounded himself with people who flattered him rather than advised him honestly. He spent lavishly on games and personal pleasures while the empire's finances deteriorated. He developed an obsession with gladiatorial combat, first attending games constantly, then insisting on participating himself, fighting in the arena against handicapped opponents or wild animals that had been weakened or drugged to ensure he would win.
This last behavior particularly scandalized the Roman elite. For an emperor to perform manual labor or to engage in activities considered demeaning to his station was shocking enough. But to fight as a gladiator, to take on the role of someone who was essentially a slave, a person without honor or dignity, this was seen as a degradation of the imperial office itself. Commodus didn't care. He styled himself as the reincarnation of Hercules, had coins struck showing himself in Hercules' lion skin, and eventually renamed Rome itself Colonia Commodania, the colony of Commodus, as if the eternal city belonged to him personally. The contrast with Marcus could not have been starker. Where Marcus had been self-effacing, Commodus demanded worship. Where Marcus had been disciplined, Commodus was self-indulgent. Where Marcus had sought to serve the state, Commodus seemed to view the state as existing to serve him. The senators and historians who wrote about this period saw Commodus as a disaster, as proof that hereditary succession was inferior to adoptive succession based on merit, as the beginning of Rome's decline from the heights it had reached under the 5 good emperors.
And yet, we should note some complexity in this assessment. While Commodus alienated the senatorial class completely, he remained popular with the common people and the army for much of his reign. He provided spectacular games, distributed largesse, and presented himself as a man of the people rather than an aloof aristocrat. The military, which had fought so long under Marcus, appreciated the peace Commodus brought, even if it meant giving up strategic objectives. Soldiers would rather be alive and at home than dead on some distant frontier, no matter how strategically important that frontier might be. But popularity could not indefinitely shield an emperor who ruled through favoritism, paranoia, and caprice. The endless conspiracies, the executions, the confiscations of property, the general atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, these eventually eroded even popular support. In December of 192, a group of conspirators that included Commodus's mistress Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and the praetorian prefect Aemilius Latus decided to act. They poisoned Commodus, but when that failed to kill him quickly enough, they sent a wrestler named Narcissus to strangle him in his bath. Commodus died on December 31st, 192, at age 31, bringing an end to the Nerva Antonine dynasty. The Senate, long oppressed by Commodus, immediately declared his memory damned. His statues were torn down, his name was erased from inscriptions, and every effort was made to obliterate his legacy from history. This damnatio memoriae, while it satisfied the senators' desire for revenge, also complicated the historical record. Much of what we know about Commodus comes from sources written by his enemies after his fall, and we must always be cautious about accepting uncritically the accounts written by those who hated their subject. Commodus's death was followed by a brief period of stability under Pertinax, one of Marcus's old generals, but Pertinax was assassinated after only 3 months. What followed was the Year of the 5 Emperors, a period of civil war in which multiple claimants fought for the throne, armies marched on Rome, and the empire teetered on the edge of dissolution. Eventually, Severus Severus emerged victorious and established a new dynasty, but the era of the philosopher emperors, of adoptive succession based on merit, of relative peace and good governance, was over. Looking back from later centuries, historians saw Marcus as the last of the good emperors, the final flowering of Rome's golden age before the descent into military anarchy, economic crisis, and eventual collapse. The 3rd century would see the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period of civil wars, invasions, economic collapse, and near dissolution of the empire. While it would be too simple to blame all of this on Commodus, his reign did mark a turning point, the moment when the careful succession planning and moderate governance of the Antonine age gave way to something more unstable and violent. Yet, in the immediate aftermath of his death, Marcus Aurelius was remembered with genuine affection and respect. The historian Cassius Dio, who was a young senator during Marcus's reign and who later wrote a massive history of Rome, devoted considerable space to Marcus and consistently portrayed him as a model emperor. Dio acknowledged Marcus's difficulties, the plague and wars that dominated his reign, but he praised Marcus's character, his dedication to duty, his philosophical temperament, and his efforts to govern justly despite overwhelming challenges. The deification of Marcus was not mere political theater. Temples were built in his honor, and people actually worshipped there, seeking his intercession with the other gods. He became, in the Roman religious imagination, a divine protector, someone who had cared for the empire in life and continued to watch over it in death. This religious veneration would continue for centuries, lasting even after Christianity became the dominant religion and the old gods were officially abandoned. But perhaps more importantly than official deification or historical assessment was the private legacy Marcus left behind, the manuscript that had been his personal spiritual exercise, his tool for maintaining sanity and virtue in impossible circumstances. The Meditations had not been published during his lifetime. They were his private notes, written for himself alone. But somehow, perhaps through family members who inherited his papers, perhaps through friends or students who recognized their value, the manuscript survived. We don't know exactly when or how the Meditations first became known to a wider audience. There were no references to the work in the immediate decades after Marcus's death, no evidence that anyone beyond perhaps a small circle knew it existed. But by the 4th century, the work was known and was beginning to be copied and circulated. It was written in Greek, which limited its audience in the Western Roman Empire, where Latin was dominant. But in the Greek-speaking East, educated people began to read and value it. The survival of the Meditations is itself somewhat miraculous. Countless ancient works have been lost, their manuscripts crumbling or being destroyed, their contents forgotten. The fact that Marcus's private philosophical notes survived the fall of the Roman Empire, the chaos of the medieval period, the countless wars and disasters that might have destroyed them, seems almost like fate, as if the universe wanted these particular words to endure. And endure they did, through the Byzantine Empire, through medieval monasteries where monks copied ancient texts, through the Islamic Golden Age, when scholars translated and preserved Greek philosophy, through the Renaissance, when Europe rediscovered its classical heritage, the Meditations survived. Each generation found something valuable in them, some wisdom that spoke across the centuries to their own circumstances and struggles. As for Marcus himself, his body was cremated according to Roman custom, and his ashes were laid to rest in the mausoleum of Hadrian, the massive tomb that Hadrian had built for himself, and that served as the resting place for the Antonine emperors. The physical remains of Marcus Aurelius rest somewhere in that ancient structure, dust among dust, atoms returned to the universal substance as his philosophy taught they would. The empire he left behind was not the empire he had hoped to leave. His son had undone much of his work, abandoned his strategic plans, and ruled in ways antithetical to everything Marcus had stood for. The carefully maintained succession system that had produced a century of good governance was broken, replaced by hereditary succession that would prove far less reliable. The northern frontier, which Marcus had fought so hard to secure, remained vulnerable and would face invasions repeatedly in the coming centuries. And yet, for all these disappointments, Marcus had done what he set out to do. He had ruled virtuously. He had maintained his philosophical principles, even in circumstances that would have broken most men. He had endured suffering without becoming bitter, wielded power without becoming corrupt, faced defeat without despairing. He had been, as far as any human can be, the philosopher-emperor that Plato had dreamed of, the person who combined wisdom with authority and tried to use that authority for good. His last day was like any other in one sense. He faced what he could not change, death itself, with the same stoic equanimity he had cultivated for decades. He accepted it as natural, as part of the universal process, as something neither good nor bad in itself, but simply inevitable. And in accepting it without fear or complaint, he demonstrated one final time what his philosophy looked like in practice,
not as theory, but as lived reality. The sun set on March 17, 180, and with it set one of Rome's last truly philosophical emperors, a man who had never wanted power, but who had used it as well as anyone could, who had written words that would outlast empires, and who had shown, through example, what it means to live with integrity,
when the world seems determined to make integrity impossible. The Meditations Beyond Time. The manuscript lay somewhere in the accumulated detritus of imperial possessions, among the papers and documents that Marcus Aurelius left behind when he died in 180. Perhaps Commodus saw it. Perhaps he read a few lines and dismissed it as more of his father's philosophical obsession, so different from his own interests. Perhaps it was passed to other family members, to Marcus's daughters, or to imperial secretaries who had served the emperor. Perhaps it simply sat in a library or archive, unnoticed for years or even decades. We don't know the Meditations' journey through the first centuries after Marcus's death. The historical record is silent. No ancient author in the 2nd or 3rd century mentions having read the work or quotes from it. This silence suggests it remained private, unknown beyond a small circle, perhaps not even recognized as particularly significant by those who did know of it. After all, it was not a formal philosophical treatise, not a polished literary work, just private notes in Greek, the kind of spiritual exercise that many educated Romans practiced but rarely shared. The first clear evidence we have of the Meditations being known comes from the 4th century, when Themistius, a philosopher and orator, seems to reference it. By then, the work was circulating among educated Greek speakers, particularly those interested in Stoic philosophy. The Byzantine Empire, which preserved and copied Greek literature while the Western Roman Empire collapsed, became the guardian of Marcus's text. Monks and scholars, recognizing its value, ensured that copies were made, that the words were preserved, even as empires fell and civilizations transformed. The Byzantine scholar Araphus of Caesarea, writing in the 10th century, possessed a manuscript of the Meditations and wrote notes in it, showing that educated Byzantines were still reading and studying Marcus 1,000 years after his death. But the work remained relatively obscure, known primarily to specialists and scholars rather than the broader educated public. It was one ancient text among thousands, valued but not celebrated, preserved but not widely discussed. When the Byzantine Empire fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, many Greek manuscripts fled westward to Italy, brought by scholars seeking refuge. The Renaissance was beginning, that great rediscovery of classical learning, and suddenly there was intense interest in ancient philosophy, literature, and history. Greek texts that had been locked away in Byzantine libraries became available to Western scholars who could finally read them in their original language rather than through Latin translations or second-hand accounts. The first printed edition of the Meditations appeared in 1559, published in Zurich by Wilhelm Zeilander under the Latin title Marci Antonini Imperatores de Rebus Sui, roughly Emperor Marcus Antoninus on his own affairs. This printing made the work available to a much wider audience than had ever been possible with hand-copied manuscripts. Educated Europeans could now purchase their own copy, read it at leisure, and discuss it with others who had also read it. But it wasn't until the 17th century that the Meditations began to have real cultural impact in Western Europe. The work was translated from Greek into Latin, the scholarly language of the age, making it accessible to those who hadn't mastered Greek. Then it was translated into vernacular languages, French, English, Italian, German. Each translation brought the work to a new audience, and each audience found something that spoke to their own circumstances. The English translation by Merrick Casaubon, published in 1654, introduced Marcus to the English-speaking world just as England was recovering from civil war and religious conflict. Readers found in Marcus a way of maintaining inner peace regardless of external turmoil, a philosophy that emphasized duty and virtue over partisan passion. The work became popular among those seeking guidance in troubled times. In France, the Meditations influenced the development of French classicism and the moral philosophy of the Enlightenment. Thinkers like Montesquieu and Rousseau engaged with Stoic ideas, sometimes agreeing, sometimes arguing, but always taking seriously the notion that philosophy should be practical, should guide life rather than just explaining the world. Marcus's example of the philosopher-emperor, someone who tried to combine wisdom with power, fascinated an age that was beginning to question absolute monarchy and imagine new forms of government. The German Romantics of the late 18th and early 19th centuries found in Marcus a different kind of value. They saw him as a tragic figure, someone struggling against fate, trying to maintain ideals in a world that didn't support them. The melancholy that runs through parts of the Meditations, the sense of weariness and disappointment, resonated with the Romantic sensibility that valued authenticity and emotional depth over classical restraint. As the work was translated and retranslated, each generation found its own Marcus, emphasized different aspects of the text, drew different lessons. Victorian Britain, at the height of its own empire, saw Marcus as a model of dutiful service, someone who had borne the burden of empire with dignity. They particularly valued his stoicism in the face of loss and hardship, his ability to persist despite personal suffering. The Meditations became recommended reading for young men entering the colonial service or the military, a guide to maintaining character under difficult circumstances. In the 20th century, as psychology developed as a discipline and people became more interested in mental health and emotional well-being, readers began to notice how much of Marcus's Stoicism was really about cognitive techniques for managing thoughts and emotions. His emphasis on examining your judgments, on recognizing that your emotional responses are choices rather than inevitable reactions, on distinguishing between what you can control and what you can't. These ideas bore a striking resemblance to what would later be called cognitive behavioral therapy. Modern psychologists and therapists, particularly those working in the CBT tradition, explicitly acknowledge the influence of Stoic philosophy in general and Marcus Aurelius in particular. The basic insight that our thoughts shape our emotions, that by changing how we think about events, we can change how we feel about them, that we have more agency over our inner lives than we often realize, all of this is central both to Stoicism and to modern cognitive therapy. Marcus, writing in a military camp nearly 2,000 years ago, was describing psychological techniques that contemporary science has validated as effective.
The Meditations found a particularly devoted readership among military personnel, soldiers facing combat, officers bearing command responsibility, found in Marcus someone who understood their situation, who had been there, who knew what it was like to send men to die and to carry that weight. Admiral James Stockdale, shot down over North Vietnam and held as a prisoner of war for 7 years, credited his survival to the Stoic philosophy he had learned from Epictetus and Marcus. In the brutal conditions of captivity and torture, the Stoic emphasis on maintaining your inner freedom, regardless of external circumstances, proved literally life-saving. But the work's appeal was never limited to military contexts. Business leaders, artists, athletes, students, people in all walks of life have found value in the Meditations. Bill Clinton reportedly kept a copy on his bedside table during his presidency. Wen Jiabao, premier of China, cited Marcus as an influence.
Countless people who have never heard of Stoicism as a formal philosophy have nonetheless read the Meditations and found in it practical wisdom for navigating life's difficulties. What accounts for this enduring appeal? Why do words written by a Roman emperor in the 2nd century continue to resonate with readers in the 21st? Part of the answer lies in the universality of the challenges Marcus addresses. Everyone faces loss, disappointment, difficult people, circumstances beyond their control. Everyone struggles with maintaining integrity under pressure, with doing the right thing when it's hard, with finding meaning in suffering. Marcus's Stoicism offers not consolation exactly, but a framework, a way of thinking about these universal human problems that makes them more manageable. There's also something compelling about the work's authenticity. These are not polished public pronouncements, but private notes, intimate, honest, sometimes repetitive, showing a man struggling with the same issues again and again. We see Marcus at his most human, reminding himself of principles he keeps forgetting, talking himself through difficult emotions, trying to be better than he is. This vulnerability, this evidence of ongoing struggle, makes him relatable in a way that a more polished philosophical treatise might not be. The very simplicity of Marcus's prose contributes to the work's accessibility. He writes in short, direct sentences, uses everyday examples, avoids technical philosophical jargon. You don't need training in philosophy to understand what he's saying. The ideas are profound, but the language is plain, which means that anyone can engage with the text directly without needing extensive commentary or interpretation. This democratic accessibility has allowed the Meditations to reach far beyond academic philosophy departments to touch ordinary readers seeking guidance. Modern editions and translations continue to appear regularly, each trying to capture for contemporary readers what Marcus was saying to himself 2 millennia ago. Some translations emphasize literal accuracy, trying to stay as close as possible to Marcus's Greek. Others prioritize readability and contemporary idiom, trying to make the text feel immediate and relevant. Gregory Hayes's widely read translation, published in 2002, aims for a conversational tone that makes Marcus sound like someone speaking directly to the reader, rather than a distant historical figure. The book has been excerpted in countless self-help books, leadership manuals, and motivational texts, sometimes with credit, sometimes without. Quotes from the Meditations appear on social media, on posters, in graduation speeches, detached from their original context, but still carrying weight. You have power over your mind, not outside events. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. These phrases have entered popular culture, recognized even by people who have never read the full text. In recent years, there has been a revival of interest in Stoicism more broadly, with new books, podcasts, and online communities devoted to applying ancient Stoic principles to contemporary life. Marcus Aurelius stands at the center of this revival, his Meditations serving as perhaps the most accessible entry point to Stoic philosophy. The fact that he was not a professional philosopher, but someone trying to apply philosophy to the challenges of an extraordinarily difficult life, makes him particularly appealing to people interested in practical wisdom rather than abstract theory. The irony is that Marcus would probably be astonished by the survival and influence of his private notes. He wrote for himself, never imagining that his words would be read by millions, translated into dozens of languages, studied by scholars, and quoted by people living in societies he could never have conceived. He sought no fame from these writings, expected no legacy, wanted no audience. And yet, precisely because they were so personal, so honest, So free from the desire to impress or persuade, they have proven more enduring than all the official pronouncements, all the imperial edicts, all the public monuments of his reign. The stone columns that bore his image have weathered and cracked. The provinces he defended have long since ceased to be Roman. The empire itself, which seemed eternal, fell and was forgotten, and then remembered again as history rather than living reality. But the words Marcus wrote by candlelight in a military tent, reminding himself how to live well, how to be good, how to find peace in chaos, those words remain, fresh and vital, speaking to each new generation that discovers them. This is perhaps the greatest testament to the value of philosophy, not as abstract speculation, but as lived practice. Marcus was not the most original Stoic thinker. He developed no new theories, proposed no innovations in logic or physics or ethics, but he showed, through decades of extraordinarily difficult circumstances, how Stoic principles could actually be lived, could actually sustain a human being through the worst that life could offer. And in doing so, in simply trying to be good in circumstances that would justify despair, he created something that has outlasted empires and spoken across the centuries to anyone who has ever struggled to make sense of suffering and find a way to live with dignity.
It is easy, reading the Meditations and studying Marcus Aurelius's reign from the distance of 2 millennia, to lose sight of the actual human being behind the philosophy and the historical record. He can become almost abstract, the philosopher emperor, a symbolic figure representing the union of wisdom and power, an ideal more than a person. But Marcus was not an abstraction. He was a man with a body that hurt, emotions that overwhelmed him, relationships that mattered, doubts that plagued him, and moments of simple human experience that had nothing to do with empire or philosophy. He had chronic health problems throughout his life, though the exact nature of these ailments is not entirely clear from the sources. The Historia Augusta mentions that he was weak and suffered from stomach troubles. Galen, the famous physician who served as personal doctor to Marcus and his family, treated the emperor for various conditions, though medical privacy being what it was in ancient Rome, some details of these treatments are recorded in Galen's writings. Marcus apparently suffered from chest and stomach pains, had trouble sleeping, and dealt with what might have been an ulcer or some other gastrointestinal condition. These health issues were not trivial inconveniences, but chronic conditions that affected his daily life, particularly during the years of military campaigning. Imagine trying to command armies, make crucial decisions, maintain discipline and morale among troops, all while dealing with constant physical discomfort or pain. The Danube frontier in winter was no place for someone with delicate health, yet Marcus spent years there, enduring harsh conditions that would have challenged even robust soldiers. His appearance, judging from statues and coins, was that of a typical aristocratic Roman. Curly hair, full beard in the Greek fashion that had become popular among educated Romans, a strong nose, deep-set eyes. The sculptures show him in various stages of life, from the smooth-faced young man he was when adopted by Antoninus to the careworn emperor of later years, his face lined with what looks like worry or weariness. In the most famous equestrian statue of Marcus, which still stands in Rome, he appears calm and dignified, the ideal of imperial authority. But the portraits from late in his life show someone worn down, exhausted, carrying burdens that show in every line of his face. He was, by all accounts, a loving father and husband, though the demands of his position often kept him apart from his family. Faustina, his wife, bore at least 13 children, possibly 14, and only 6 of these survived past childhood. The deaths of children were tragically common in the ancient world, even among the wealthy, but that commonality did not make the losses any easier to bear. Marcus would have held infants who died within days or weeks. He would have watched toddlers sicken and fail, He would have seen children who seemed healthy suddenly fall ill and be gone within a short time. How does a Stoic father grieve? The philosophy taught that death is natural, that we should not rage against what we cannot control, that our loved ones are preferred indifferents to be valued, but not depended upon for our happiness. But philosophy, however deeply embraced, cannot entirely numb the pain of holding your dead child. Marcus must have struggled to reconcile his philosophical principles with his natural human grief. The Meditations contain passages that seem to be him working through this tension, reminding himself that emotional suffering comes from his judgments about events rather than the events themselves, but also acknowledging the reality and difficulty of loss. His relationship with Faustina has been the subject of much historical speculation, as mentioned earlier. Ancient gossip accused her of infidelity, of conducting affairs with gladiators and actors, of political manipulation. But Marcus himself never publicly criticized her, defended her reputation when she was alive, and honored her memory lavishly after her death in 176. He established charitable foundations in her name, had her deified, and erected statues and monuments to her. Either he was blind to her supposed faults, or the gossip was largely invented by those who disliked her, or perhaps he chose to love her despite her imperfections, or perhaps most likely the marriage was more complex than any simple characterization can capture. In his Meditations, Marcus mentions Faustina only briefly, referring to her character and noting his good fortune in having her as his wife. For someone so private and restrained in his writing, this mention itself suggests genuine affection. He also thanks his adoptive father Antoninus for the example of a happy marriage, suggesting that Marcus valued this aspect of life and tried to emulate what he had observed in his youth. His daily routine, when not on campaign, followed a pattern common among educated aristocratic Romans with his own philosophical modifications. He would rise early, often before dawn, and spend time in study and reflection. This was when he did much of his philosophical reading and writing, the quiet hours before the demands of the day intruded. Then would come the morning greeting, the salutatio, when clients, officials, and various people seeking imperial favor would be received. This was a crucial part of Roman social and political life, maintaining the networks of patronage and obligation that held society together. The middle of the day might involve meetings with advisors, judicial hearings where Marcus personally adjudicated cases, reviews of petitions and documents requiring imperial attention, correspondence with provincial governors and military commanders. The administrative work of empire was endless, a constant flow of decisions large and small, problems to be solved, conflicts to be mediated, policies to be set. Marcus took this work seriously, reading documents carefully rather than simply delegating to subordinates, trying to ensure that justice was done and that imperial resources were used wisely. Meals were relatively simple by imperial standards. Marcus had been influenced early by philosophical teachers who emphasized frugality, and while he ate well, he did not indulge in the kind of elaborate banquets that some emperors favored. The evening might bring more administrative work, more meetings, or perhaps time for reading and conversation with friends or fellow philosophers. Sleep, when it came, was often troubled, both from his health problems and by the weight of responsibility he carried.
When on campaign, the routine was necessarily different. Life in a military camp meant simpler accommodations, though Marcus, as emperor, would have had better quarters than ordinary soldiers. It meant dealing with the immediate concerns of warfare, supply lines, troop movements, negotiations with allies and enemies, responses to crises and emergencies. It also meant more danger, not just from enemy action, but from disease, accidents, and the general hardships of military life. Marcus was no longer young during the Germanic Wars, and the physical demands of campaigning would have been significant for a man in his 40s and 50s with chronic health issues. Yet he persisted, year after year, because duty required it. This persistence itself tells us something important about Marcus's character. He was not naturally suited to military command, did not glory in war, did not find the military life appealing. He did it because it needed to be done, because he had been placed in a position where his decisions affected millions, and because his philosophical principles taught him that a person should fulfill their role in society regardless of personal preference. His personal relationships beyond his immediate family are harder to reconstruct from the surviving sources. The Meditations thanks numerous teachers and mentors, showing that Marcus maintained gratitude and affection for those who had shaped him. He seems to have had genuine friendships with some of these people, relationships that went beyond the formal teacher-student dynamic. The correspondence with Fronto, his rhetoric teacher, which survives in fragmentary form, shows real warmth and affection, even though Marcus ultimately chose philosophy over rhetoric as his primary intellectual commitment. Among his advisors and generals, Marcus seems to have inspired loyalty and respect. People were willing to serve him, to follow him into difficult campaigns, to support his policies, even when they were unpopular or costly. This suggests that he had personal qualities, warmth, integrity, fairness, that made people want to please him and help him succeed. He was not a distant, cold figure, but someone who could connect with others, who took time to listen and consider advice, who treated subordinates with respect. At the same time, there must have been a profound loneliness to Marcus's position. No one else could truly share the burden of imperial responsibility. No one else could make the final decisions that only the emperor could make. No one else could fully understand what it was like to bear that weight constantly, knowing that mistakes could cost thousands of lives and that there was no one to turn to for help because you were the ultimate authority. The Meditations themselves read partly as the thoughts of someone profoundly alone, turning inward because there is nowhere else to turn, examining his own soul because it is the only realm over which he has complete control. His intellectual life continued throughout his reign, though it must have been squeezed into whatever moments he could find amid his other responsibilities. He continued to read philosophy, particularly Stoic texts, but also Plato and other philosophers. He continued to think about ethical and metaphysical questions, to try to understand the nature of the universe and humanity's place in it. The Meditations shows someone engaged in ongoing philosophical reflection, not someone who had learned a system young and then simply applied it mechanically for the rest of his life. He was still working through questions, still refining his understanding, still struggling to align his behavior with his principles. There are moments in the Meditations that reveal a sense of humor, dry and somewhat dark, but present nonetheless. His observation about natural processes, noting that things are beautiful precisely at the moment they are most imperfect, that bread is most appealing when it cracks in the oven, that olives are loveliest when nearly overripe, shows someone paying attention to everyday details and finding meaning in them. His comments about dealing with difficult people, while serious in their philosophical content, sometimes have an undertone that suggests he is ruefully amused by human nature, even as he's frustrated by it. Marcus Aurelius the man, as opposed to Marcus the emperor or Marcus the philosopher, remains somewhat elusive despite all we know about him. He left us his private thoughts, but not really his feelings. He told us what he believed, but not always how he felt about the gap between belief and reality. He demonstrated extraordinary perseverance and dedication, but rarely explained what motivated him at the deepest level, beyond duty and philosophical conviction. Was there joy in his life? Moments of simple happiness, unconnected to virtue or responsibility? Did he find beauty and wonder in the world, despite all its suffering? Did he love deeply, laugh genuinely,
experience the full range of human emotion, even while trying to govern those emotions philosophically. We can glimpse possibilities in the text of the Meditations. His appreciation for natural beauty, his gratitude toward the people who had shaped him, his determination to see the good in others, these suggest someone capable of positive emotion and genuine connection. But he was also deeply private, disciplined in what he revealed even to himself in his private writings, focused on what needed to be done rather than how he felt about it. The man remains, in some essential ways, hidden behind the philosophy and the imperial role, revealed in fragments but never entirely visible. What we can say with certainty is that he was human, profoundly and sometimes painfully so. He struggled, he suffered, he doubted, he had to keep reminding himself of truths he kept forgetting. He was not a sage who had achieved perfect wisdom, but someone engaged in the ongoing work of trying to be good, trying to live according to principles that were easier to state than to embody. And it is perhaps this humanity, this evidence of struggle and imperfection, that makes him so compelling across the centuries. He was not superhuman, but someone showing what a human being can achieve through dedication, discipline, and determination to live with integrity regardless of circumstances.
Legacy and lessons. 2,000 years have passed since Marcus Aurelius sat in a military camp along the Danube, writing his private reflections by lamplight. Empires have risen and fallen, languages have evolved and disappeared. Technologies have transformed human life beyond anything a Roman could have imagined. And yet, the words he wrote, never intending them for publication, continued to be read, studied, quoted, and applied by millions of people seeking guidance in their own struggles with duty, loss, meaning, and the challenge of living well. What is Marcus's legacy? On one level, it is the legacy of any Roman emperor. Laws, buildings, coins, inscriptions, the ordinary administrative detritus of rule. But these material remnants, while interesting to historians, are not what most people mean when they speak of Marcus Aurelius's legacy. His true legacy is the example he set and the words he left behind, the model of a person trying to unite wisdom with power, philosophy with practical action, contemplation with engagement in the world. The concept of the philosopher king goes back to Plato, who argued in his Republic that the ideal state would be ruled by philosophers, people who understood truth and goodness and who would govern according to reason rather than passion or self-interest. For most of history, this remained a theoretical ideal, attractive in principle but seemingly impossible in practice. Power corrupts, as the saying goes, and those who seek power are rarely those most suited to wield it wisely. Philosophers tend to be contemplative, removed from practical affairs, more interested in ideas than action. Leaders tend to be pragmatic, focused on results, impatient with abstract speculation. Marcus came as close as perhaps anyone in history to embodying Plato's ideal. He was genuinely philosophical, deeply committed to Stoic principles, someone who spent decades studying wisdom and trying to live according to it. And yet, he was also emperor, wielding absolute power over the largest empire the world had yet seen, making life and death decisions, commanding armies, administering provinces, the very opposite of the contemplative life. That he managed to do both, to remain philosophical while being imperial, to maintain his principles while exercising power, this is what makes him so remarkable and so influential. The example he set was not one of perfection, but of persistent effort.
The Meditations makes clear that Marcus struggled constantly to live up to his own standards, that he had to keep reminding himself of principles he kept forgetting, that he felt frustration, weariness, and discouragement. This vulnerability, this honesty about his own imperfections, makes him a more valuable model than if he had presented himself as having achieved perfect wisdom. He shows us not what it looks like to be perfect, but what it looks like to keep trying to be better despite constant failure. His influence on subsequent political leaders has been significant, though not always in ways we might expect. Many rulers have claimed to admire Marcus, have cited him as an influence, have tried to model themselves after him. But admiration is one thing, and emulation is another. It is easy to praise the philosopher emperor while ignoring the philosophy and focusing only on the emperor part, using Marcus's example to legitimate one's own exercise of power without embracing the self-discipline, humility, and ethical constraints that characterized his rule. The true students of Marcus are not necessarily those who govern nations, but those who try to govern themselves, who work to maintain integrity in difficult circumstances, who seek to do their duty without complaint or self-pity, who strive to respond to what life brings with reason rather than emotion. These students come from all walks of life: soldiers maintaining discipline under fire, business leaders trying to balance profit with ethics, parents raising children while managing their own stress and uncertainty, anyone facing challenges that test their character and resilience. The Stoic philosophy that Marcus practiced has seen a remarkable revival in recent decades, particularly in the English-speaking world. This modern Stoicism, while drawing on ancient sources, is adapted to contemporary concerns. It emphasizes practical techniques for managing stress, anxiety, and difficult emotions. It offers a framework for decision-making that prioritizes what you can control over what you cannot. It provides methods for examining your thoughts and beliefs to determine whether they serve you well. It encourages resilience, the ability to face setbacks without being destroyed by them. Much of this modern Stoicism explicitly looks to Marcus Aurelius as its exemplar. The Meditations is probably the most widely read Stoic text today, more accessible than Epictetus's discourses and more practical than the systematic philosophical works of earlier Stoics like Chrysippus. People turn to Marcus not for a complete philosophical system, but for guidance on specific challenges, how to deal with difficult people, how to maintain equanimity when things go wrong, how to find meaning in suffering, how to act with integrity when external pressures push toward expediency. The therapeutic applications of Stoic philosophy, particularly its connections to cognitive behavioral therapy, represent another aspect of Marcus's legacy. When modern psychologists teach clients to examine their automatic thoughts, to challenge irrational beliefs, to distinguish between events and their interpretations of events, they are applying, whether they realize it or not, techniques that Marcus described 2,000 years ago. The insight that our thoughts shape our emotions, that we have agency over our mental lives, that suffering often comes from our judgments rather than external circumstances themselves, this is the foundation of both Stoic philosophy and modern cognitive therapy. Beyond psychology and philosophy, Marcus's influence can be traced in literature, art, and popular culture. He appears as a character in numerous novels, always portrayed as the wise and good emperor, a figure of nostalgic longing for a time when power and wisdom were united. The film Gladiator, while taking enormous liberties with historical accuracy, captured something of how Marcus is popularly imagined: the philosopher reluctantly ruling, the good man trying to hold back chaos, the ideal leader betrayed by an unworthy successor. This popular image of Marcus, while simplified and romanticized, is not entirely inaccurate. He was trying to be good in circumstances that made goodness extraordinarily difficult. He was striving to maintain philosophical principles while exercising absolute power. He was attempting to serve rather than dominate, to use authority responsibly rather than self-indulgently. And the tragedy of his successor, the contrast between Marcus's restraint and Commodus's excess, does reflect a genuine historical pattern that speaks to enduring questions about power, succession, and the fragility of good governance. What lessons does Marcus offer to our own time? In an age of political polarization, he reminds us that we share a common humanity with those we disagree with, that anger and contempt are choices we make rather than inevitable responses, that we can maintain our principles while treating opponents with respect. In an age of constant distraction and information overload, he reminds us to focus on what truly matters, to distinguish between what we can control and what we cannot, to invest our limited time and energy wisely rather than scattering it across countless trivial concerns. In an age of anxiety and uncertainty, when many people feel overwhelmed by forces beyond their control, Marcus offers a philosophy of resilience. Stoicism teaches that while we cannot control what happens to us, we can control how we respond. We cannot prevent loss, disappointment, betrayal, suffering, but we can choose to face these experiences with dignity rather than despair, with reason rather than emotion. This is not toxic positivity that denies the reality of problems, but a clear-eyed realism that acknowledges difficulty while refusing to be destroyed by it.
In an age that often measures success by external achievements, wealth, status, power, recognition, Marcus reminds us that the quality of our lives depends not on what we accomplish or accumulate, but on who we are, on our character, on whether we act with virtue regardless of outcomes. He shows that it is possible to have every external advantage, every form of worldly success, and still find that these things do not provide lasting satisfaction. What matters is living according to your principles, maintaining your integrity, being the kind of person you can respect when you examine yourself honestly. In an age of celebrity and personal branding, where people carefully curate their public image and seek constant validation, Marcus's privacy and humility offer a countermodel. He wrote for himself, not for an audience. He sought to be good, not to be seen as good. He performed his duties without demanding recognition or gratitude. He accepted criticism and correction without defensiveness. He judged himself more harshly than he judged others. This kind of authentic commitment to virtue, untainted by the need for external validation, seems rare and valuable in our current cultural moment. Perhaps most importantly, in an age that often feels hopeless, when large-scale problems seem intractable and individual action seems futile, Marcus reminds us that we can still choose how we live, that maintaining our own virtue and treating others well remains within our power regardless of what is happening in the wider world. We may not be able to fix everything that is broken, but we can still be decent human beings. We may not be able to control outcomes, but we can control our efforts. We may not be able to eliminate suffering, but we can face it with courage rather than complaint. The limitations of Marcus's philosophy should also be acknowledged. Stoicism can sometimes shade into emotional detachment or resignation. The emphasis on accepting what you cannot change can become an excuse for not trying to change things that actually could be changed with sufficient effort. The focus on individual virtue can neglect the importance of systemic change and collective action.
The Stoics' equanimity in the face of injustice can look like complicity if it leads to passivity rather than resistance. Moreover, Marcus's own example is complicated. His persecution of Christians, his apparent blindness to his son's unsuitability for rule, his exhausting wars that achieved little lasting benefit, these remind us that even philosopher emperors make mistakes, that wisdom does not guarantee perfect judgment, that good intentions do not ensure good outcomes. We can learn from Marcus while still recognizing his flaws and limitations, can admire his effort while acknowledging his failures. Yet even acknowledging these limitations, the core of what Marcus offers remains valuable. The emphasis on self-examination, on questioning your own thoughts and motivations, on maintaining integrity regardless of circumstances, on treating others with respect even when they do not deserve it, on finding meaning through duty rather than pleasure, on accepting mortality without fear. These are insights that transcend the specific context of second-century Rome and speak to enduring human concerns. As we face our own challenges in the 21st century, different in detail but similar in kind to those Marcus faced, his example and his words continue to offer guidance. We may not be emperors, we may not command legions or govern provinces, but we all face the challenge of living well, of maintaining our humanity in dehumanizing circumstances, of doing what is right when it would be easier to do what is expedient. We all struggle with loss, disappointment, difficult people and circumstances beyond our control. We all must choose again and again what kind of person we will be, how we will respond to what life brings. Marcus shows us one way of meeting these challenges, not the only way, but a way that has proven its worth across 2 millennia. His legacy is not a system of answers, but a set of questions, not a destination, but a path, not perfection, but persistent effort toward being better than we are. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of all, that the examined life, the life of constant self-reflection and determined effort to live according to our highest principles, is worth living even when, especially when, circumstances make it extraordinarily difficult to do so. The philosopher-emperor has been dead for nearly 2,000 years. His empire has crumbled into history. His monuments have weathered and worn, but his words remain fresh and vital, speaking to each new generation that discovers them. In an uncertain future that he could never have imagined, Marcus Aurelius continues to offer what he tried to cultivate in himself: wisdom for enduring hardship, courage for facing uncertainty, and a vision of human dignity that survives whatever circumstances may bring.
And so we come to the end of this journey through the life of Marcus Aurelius, from a boy born into privilege in second-century Rome to an emperor dying on a distant frontier, from a young man captivated by philosophy to an old man trying to hold an empire together, from private student to public figure, from someone who wanted nothing more than a quiet life of contemplation to someone forced to bear responsibilities that would have broken most people. What strikes us, looking back across nearly 2,000 years, is not how different Marcus's world was from ours, though certainly the differences are vast, but how similar the fundamental challenges remain. He struggled with doing his duty when he wanted to do something else. We struggle with that too. He tried to maintain his integrity in circumstances that encouraged corruption. So do we. He faced loss and grief and had to find a way to keep going. We know that pain. He dealt with difficult people and frustrating situations and tried not to let them embitter him. We understand that challenge. The technology has changed. The political systems have evolved.
The specific details of daily life bear little resemblance to ancient Rome. But the questions that matter most remain remarkably constant. How should we live? What gives life meaning? How do we respond to suffering? How do we treat others? How do we maintain hope when circumstances are bleak? These are not questions that have definitive answers that hold for all time, but they are questions that each generation, each person must wrestle with anew. Marcus's approach to these questions, grounded in Stoic philosophy, but shaped by his own experience and temperament, offers one model among many. It is not the only way to live well, but it is a way that has proven its worth through the testimony of those who have found guidance in his words. The emphasis on self-discipline, on examining your thoughts and judgments, on distinguishing between what you can control and what you cannot, on treating others with respect even when they do not deserve it, on finding meaning through service rather than through pleasure or accumulation. These principles have helped countless people navigate difficult circumstances and maintain their humanity when external pressures threatened to degrade it. But perhaps more important than any specific principle or technique is the larger example Marcus set, the model of a person engaged in the ongoing work of trying to be good. He did not present himself as having achieved wisdom, but as striving toward it. He did not claim to have overcome all his weaknesses, but acknowledged the constant struggle to manage them. He did not suggest that philosophy made life easy, but rather that it made life bearable, providing a framework for endurance and meaning when external circumstances offered neither. This honesty, this admission of ongoing struggle and imperfection, may be Marcus's most valuable gift to us. We live in an age that often presents self-improvement as a destination to be reached, a problem to be solved, a state of perfection to be achieved. We are bombarded with messages suggesting that if we just find the right technique, follow the right plan, adopt the right mindset, we can somehow transcend our limitations and live without struggle or difficulty. This is, of course, an illusion, a promise that cannot be kept, and the constant failure to achieve this impossible standard can lead to despair and self-recrimination. Marcus offers a different model, not perfection, but persistent effort, not achievement, but practice, not a final destination, but an ongoing journey. He kept a journal of reminders because he kept forgetting what he needed to remember. He wrote the same things to himself repeatedly because he kept needing to relearn them. He struggled with frustration, weariness, and discouragement, and his response was not to pretend these struggles did not exist, but to acknowledge them and work with them, to keep returning to his principles even when he kept failing to live up to them. This is a more realistic and ultimately more compassionate approach to the challenge of living well. It accepts that we are imperfect, that we will make mistakes, that we will fall short of our ideals, and that this is normal and human rather than a sign of failure. What matters is not whether we occasionally fail, but whether we keep trying, not whether we feel perfect calm and equanimity all the time, but whether we keep working to cultivate these qualities even when they seem impossibly distant. As we consider Marcus's life and legacy, we might ask ourselves, what would it look like to apply his principles to our own circumstances? Not to try to become Marcus, which would be both impossible and pointless, but to take seriously the questions he asked and the methods he employed, and see whether they offer guidance for our own struggles.
It might mean starting a practice of self-examination, taking time each day to reflect on how we responded to events, whether we acted according to our values, where we fell short, and how we might do better tomorrow.
It might mean working to distinguish between what we can control and what we cannot, investing our energy where it can make a difference rather than exhausting ourselves trying to change things beyond our influence. It might mean examining our judgments about events, recognizing that much of our emotional suffering comes from our interpretations rather than from the events themselves, and considering whether we could interpret things differently. It might mean treating others with more patience and respect, recognizing that difficult people are usually struggling with their own challenges and ignorance rather than being maliciously trying to harm us. It might mean accepting loss and disappointment without letting them embitter us, acknowledging our grief while not being destroyed by it. It might mean finding meaning through duty and service rather than through pleasure and acquisition, through who we are rather than what we achieve or accumulate. Most fundamentally, it might mean accepting that life is difficult, that suffering is inevitable, that we will face circumstances beyond our control, and that this is not a cosmic injustice, but simply the nature of existence. And then, having accepted this, choosing to respond with dignity, courage, and determination to live according to our principles, regardless of what circumstances bring. This is not resignation, but a kind of fierce commitment to maintaining our humanity, whatever happens. Marcus Aurelius was not perfect. He made mistakes, both personal and political. He could not solve all the problems he faced, could not prevent the plague or stop the invasions or ensure a capable successor. But he could and did maintain his integrity through it all, kept trying to be good when circumstances made goodness extraordinarily difficult, showed what philosophical virtue looks like, not as an abstract ideal, but as a lived reality. The empire he defended has long since fallen. The frontiers he tried to secure eventually collapsed. The administrative reforms he implemented were modified or abandoned. The wars he fought achieved temporary gains that were quickly lost. In all the external measures by which emperors are usually judged, his reign could be seen as a failure, or at best, a holding action that merely delayed inevitable decline. But in the measure that he himself would have valued most, the quality of his character and the integrity of his efforts, Marcus succeeded. He remained true to his philosophical principles, even when circumstances tested them almost beyond endurance. He used power responsibly, without letting it corrupt him. He treated others with respect and fairness. He endured suffering without becoming bitter. He faced death without fear, and he left behind words that have offered guidance and comfort to millions of people across 2,000 years. As you settle back into your own life, facing your own challenges and uncertainties, perhaps you will carry something of Marcus's example with you, not as a burden or an impossible standard, but as a reminder that it is possible to live with integrity even in difficult circumstances, that philosophy is not just abstract theorizing, but a practical tool for navigating life's inevitable hardships, that we always have the choice, however constrained by external circumstances, of who we will be and how we will respond. The storm winds of the Danube have long since carried away the smoke from ancient campfires. The tent where Marcus wrote by candlelight has crumbled into dust. The empire has fallen. The legions have marched away into history, and the world has changed beyond anything a Roman could have imagined. But the questions Marcus asked himself in the darkness remain, and the attempt to answer them with integrity, with courage, with persistent effort toward being better than we are, this remains as urgent and necessary today as it was 2,000 years ago on a frozen frontier far from home. Good night, and thank you for joining me on this journey through the life and legacy of Marcus Aurelius. the philosopher emperor, the reluctant ruler, the man who wanted only to study wisdom, but who instead had to live it under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. If you found value in this exploration, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, may you face your own challenges with wisdom, courage, and determination to live according to your highest principles, whatever circumstances bring. Sleep well.